Hey there and welcome back. If you are getting cozy now, perhaps with the lights subdued and something warm at hand, settle in, because tonight's story is one that is, in its modest, private way, the story behind the story. You may have heard, in earlier nights of this series, the plain, slow accumulating story of Queen Charlotte of England. The German girl from a minor North German duchy who arrived in London at 17, married a king she had never seen, bore him 15 children, lived through his madness and her own long widowhood while not a widow, and died at Kew in 1818, in the little upright posture that her last illness required. We have walked the corridors of her houses. We have watched her women dress her and undress her. We have seen the private life of a queen who never quite stopped being homesick for the country she had left. Tonight we are going to go back further. Tonight we are going to spend an evening with the woman who made her. Not the king who married her, not the brother who arranged the match, not the courtiers who received her in London, her mother. The German princess who raised her, taught her, shaped her, and died before she could see what her daughter became. Her name was Elisabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. She was born in 1713 and died in 1761. She married, in 1735, into the brief ducal house of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She bore 10 children, of whom several died young. She was widowed at 39. She raised her surviving family in a faint, modest residence in North Germany called Mirow, which was not even the capital of the duchy. She died at 48. Of a sudden illness that the records do not name precisely, in the summer of 1761. Her daughter, Charlotte, was 17 at the time of her death, and was already engaged, by the narrow, deliberate diplomacy of the previous months, to be the next Queen of England. Elisabeth Albertine never met the man her daughter married. She never saw the country her daughter ruled. She was buried in a simple Lutheran chapel in Mirow, weeks before Charlotte sailed for England, and Charlotte, when she went alone. The mother who had taught her everything was already gone. The whole reign of Queen Charlotte of England, the 57 years of her presence at the centre of British public life, the 15 children, the gardens at Kew, the long household, the late grief of her husband's madness, all of it took place after Elisabeth Albertine's death. The mother gave the daughter the ground she stood on, and then was not there to see her stand on it. This is the story of that mother, the woman who made Queen Charlotte, the German princess in the limited German residence, raising the child who became one of the longest reigning consorts in British history. So get comfortable, pour yourself something warm if you have not already. Let your eyes close if they want to. We are going back to the early years of the 18th century, to a spare Thuringian court at Hildburghausen, to a girl who was born into one obscure German princely house, and who, at 22, married into another. We are going to walk with her through her own childhood, and her own marriage, and her own widowhood, all the restrained, thoughtful chapters of a life that the larger histories rarely mention, but that produced, in the end, one of the most consequential women of the Georgian age. Let us begin where she began. At Hildburghausen, in the year 1713. Hildburghausen is a modest town in the part of Germany that the 18th century called Thuringia, in what is now the central southern part of the modern country. It sits in a valley among deep forested hills, with a plain river running through it, in the kind of landscape that you find across that whole region of Central Europe. The town in 1713 was the seat of a minor ducal house, one of the many little ducal houses that the Holy Roman Empire had produced in its long-measured subdivision of the German lands. The Duchy of Saxe-Hildburghausen was not large. It was not rich. It was not, in any obvious sense, important. It was one of dozens of brief German duchies of similar size and significance, each of them with its own duke, its own court, its own faint bureaucracy, its own coinage, its own army of perhaps a few hundred men, its own minor place in the long attentive arithmetic of the empire. It is worth, before we go any further, spending a moment to picture this place properly, because Hildburghausen, although obscure to most ears today, was a real and defined town, with its own character, and Elisabeth Albertine's earliest experience of the world was the experience of growing up in this place. The town sat, as I have said, in a valley. The valley was the valley of the river Werra, which ran through the town from west to east in a deliberate curve. The hills on either side of the valley were muted, perhaps a few hundred feet at their highest. They were forested, in the way that the Thuringian hills had been forested for centuries, with mixed woodland of oak and beech and pine. The valley floor was given over to fields and narrow farms and the simple accumulated agricultural life of the region. The town itself sat on a limited flat area on the southern bank of the river, with the residence of the dukes on a slightly raised platform at the eastern end of the town, separated from the rest of the town by a spare open area that served in part as the parade ground for the duchy's restrained army. The town had been founded, in any organised sense, in the medieval period, although there had been settlement in the valley for many centuries before that. It had been the seat of various branches of the Saxon ducal family for generations. It had been raised in the late 17th century to its current status as the seat of an independent duchy, with the modest, thoughtful subdivision of the Saxon lands that had occurred on the death of Duke Ernest the Pious in 1675. Saxe-Hildburghausen was therefore, in 1713, a relatively new duchy, less than 40 years old, as a separate entity. The court at Hildburghausen had been working for those 40 years to establish itself in the plain accumulated way that minor new duchies from that era had to do, with the measured construction of the residence, the attentive organisation of the court ceremonial, the deliberate establishment of the little accumulated relationships with the surrounding territories that any brief duchy needed in order to function. The residence itself, where Elisabeth Albertine was born, was a building that had been substantially renovated in the previous 20 years. It had been originally a faint castle of the medieval period, of which substantial portions of the older walls were still incorporated into the structure of the building. It had been rebuilt in the late 17th century in the modest Baroque style that narrow German duchies from that era preferred when they wanted to bring their residences up to date without spending money they did not have. The result was a building of 3 connected blocks around a central courtyard, with the main residential rooms in the central block, the court offices and simple ceremonial rooms in one wing, and the household services and limited stables in the other. The chapel was at the eastern end of the central block. The whole building was perhaps 200 feet on its longest dimension. It was a substantial building by the standards of spare German residences, but not in any sense a grand one. The town outside the residence was, in 1713, the kind of restrained German town that the period produced in considerable numbers over the empire. It had a market square at its centre, with a modest town hall on one side and the parish church on another. It had roughly 15 or 20 streets of varying respectability radiating out from the centre. It had a plain school, a minor hospital, several little inns, a limited number of merchant houses of varying prosperity, and the brief accumulated mix of houses and workshops and faint commercial premises that constituted the daily fabric of the town's life. The population of the town in 1713 was about 2,000. The wider population of the duchy in the surrounding villages and narrow market towns was perhaps another 15 or 20,000. The whole accumulated population of Saxe-Hildburghausen was, by the standards of the European political units from that era, very simple indeed. But it was a genuine place, with living people in it, and Elisabeth Albertine's limited accumulated childhood was the spare accumulated childhood of a princess in this plain place. The townspeople of Hildburghausen were, for the most part, ordinary German Lutherans from that era, conducting their restrained daily lives in the modest daily ways that such people conducted them. They worked, they went to church, they raised their children, they paid their taxes to the Duke, who maintained the plain accumulated apparatus of governance with the funds. They knew by sight the members of the ducal family. They greeted them with the minor thoughtful respect that the period required when they encountered them in the streets. They were, in the even way of little German town populations, fond of their brief ducal family in the way that ordinary subjects of faint principalities from that era were generally fond of their narrow reigning houses, although the fondness was not, in any obvious sense, anything more than the ordinary residual loyalty of a simple population to the limited rulers who had been provided to them. The Duke who reigned over this spare territory in 1713 was Ernest Frederick I. He was 32 years old. He had succeeded his father in 1715, but his actual reign at the time of our story was still under the regency of his mother, because he was technically a minor when his father died. The mother, Sophia Henriette of Waldeck, was the regent. The court at Hildburghausen, in the early years of the century, was therefore a court that was being run by a dowager duchess and a young duke not yet entirely in possession of his own authority. It was a hushed court. It was a measured court. It was not a court at which great events occurred. In the autumn of that year, on the 4th of August, in the restrained ducal residence at Hildburghausen, Duke Ernest Frederick's wife Sophia Albertine of Urbach gave birth to a daughter. The daughter was christened Elisabeth Albertine. She was the third of the eventual children of the marriage. She was, by the modest attentive arithmetic of dynastic eligibility, a princess of the Holy Roman Empire of the third or fourth tier, an entirely respectable but not glittering match for any future husband whose family would consent to take her. She was born into a plain, deliberate world. The residence at Hildburghausen was a building of the kind that minor German duchies all had, a modest country palace of several connected blocks, with a courtyard and stables and a chapel, and a few formal rooms for the conduct of court business, and a great many little private rooms in which the family actually lived. The court itself was brief. There were perhaps 30 or 40 officers and servants in the immediate household, with another 100 or so in the wider establishment of the duchy's faint bureaucracy. The town outside the palace gates had perhaps 2,000 inhabitants. The whole world that the narrow Princess Elisabeth Albertine was born into could have fitted, in its entirety, into the courtyard of any of the great palaces of Vienna or Versailles, and would have had room left over. This was, however, not in any sense a deprivation. The simple German princely courts of the early 18th century were, in their own way, the cultivated centres of an entire layer of European life. The dukes and princes of the Holy Roman Empire might rule territories that were limited by the standards of France or Britain or Russia, but the cultural ambitions of those courts were considerable. The court at Hildburghausen kept musicians. It maintained a spare library. It hosted travelling scholars and clergymen, and the occasional foreign emissary on their way between larger courts. The children of the ducal house received an education that was, by the standards from that era, thoughtful and serious. They learned several languages. They learned music. They learned the restrained social arts that princesses were expected to master. They learned the modest, measured theology of the Lutheran Church, which was the established religion of the duchy. Elisabeth Albertine's earliest years would have been spent in the plain, attentive manner of all such children. The nursery at the Hildburghausen residence was on the upper floor of the central block, in a wing that the Dowager Duchess had designated for the children's use early in the century. There were nursery maids. There was a wet nurse in the early months, although by the standards from that era, a princess of her rank was as likely to be nursed by her own mother as by another woman. There was a routine of meals and rest, and the still training in the minor daily protocols of a princess that began, in such households, almost as soon as the child could walk. She was the third of the children. Her older sister Caroline had been born in 1707, 6 years before her, and was therefore already a substantial figure in the nursery by the time Elisabeth Albertine arrived. Her older brother had died in infancy, before Elisabeth Albertine was born, in the subdued tragedy of high infant mortality that all 18th century families knew. There would be more siblings to come. By the end of her mother's childbearing years, Elisabeth Albertine would have 11 brothers and sisters in total, of whom 8 would survive to adulthood. The family was, by the standards of any little German princely house from that era, exactly what such a family was supposed to be: large, hierarchical, organized around the brief deliberate prospects of each child's eventual marriage and establishment. The mother, Sophia Albertine of Urbach, was a woman of notable seriousness and sizable culture. She had been born into the faint county of Urbach, another narrow territory of the empire, into a family with a long tradition of thoughtful Lutheran piety and large intellectual cultivation. She brought to Hildburghausen, when she married Ernest Frederick in 1704, the lower habits of an earnest German princess from that era. She read. She played music. She corresponded with relations over the empire in the simple, measured way that princesses of her rank had done for generations. She supervised her children's education with the kind of personal attention that the period considered admirable in a mother of her standing. The girls of Hildburghausen, including Elisabeth Albertine, grew up under the eye of a mother who took their education disciplined, and who expected them to take it devout themselves. The father, Duke Ernest Frederick, was a man of less obvious force of character. He was, by the accounts that survive, a kindly but not particularly distinguished man who had come into his limited inheritance early, and who managed it with the attentive conservatism that spare German duchies tended to require of their rulers. He was not a celebrated patron. He was not a noted soldier. He was not, in any obvious sense, a remarkable figure. He ruled his restrained duchy in the modest, deliberate manner that the period expected, with the attentions to the hushed business of plain principalities, and the children of his marriage grew up in the minor constant atmosphere that such a father produced. The household at Hildburghausen was, in its little thoughtful way, the household of a serious German Lutheran princely family of the early 18th century. The day began early. The children were woken at 6, washed, dressed in the brief measured clothes that the period considered appropriate, and taken to the chapel for the morning prayer that began every day in households of this kind. The chapel was faint. It was on the ground floor of the central block. The pastor, who was the duchy's senior Lutheran clergyman, conducted the morning prayer in the narrow, attentive way that the family expected. The hymns were sung, the brief reading from Scripture was given. The simple, deliberate prayer for the family and for the duchy and for the empire was offered. The whole ceremony took perhaps 20 minutes. The children then went to their breakfast, which was taken in the limited dining room near the nursery, in the spare, thoughtful manner that the period preferred. The lessons began at 8. There was a tutor for the boys, who came in 3 days a week and who taught them Latin and history and arithmetic. There was a separate arrangement for the girls, who were taught largely by their mother in the early years, with the assistance of a French governess who had been engaged when Elisabeth Albertine was 3, and who was a permanent member of the household for the next 15 years. The French governess, whose name was Mademoiselle Dupré, taught the girls French in the restrained, thorough way that the period required, and supplemented their education with the modest daily attentions to deportment and music and embroidery that a princess was expected to master. Elisabeth Albertine was, by the reports that survive, an apt pupil. She took to her lessons with the kind of serious attention that her mother encouraged. She was not, by all accounts, a brilliant child in any showy sense. She was not the kind of plain prodigy whose precocious accomplishments are recorded in the family papers. She was, rather, what the 18th century would have called a measured child. She learned what she was given to learn. She remembered what she was taught. She practiced the still skills with the minor measured patience that the period considered the proper habit for a girl of her station. By the time she was 10, she could read and write in German and French with equal facility, could play the harpsichord at the little competent level that the period required, could embroider with reasonable skill, and could conduct herself in the brief social occasions of the court with the attentive manner that her mother had taught her. And she was also, in those early years, developing the subdued piety that would be the most lasting of her mother's gifts to her. The Lutheran faith of the Hildburghausen court was not the showy display piety of certain other German courts. It was the faint, deliberate daily piety of a serious northern Protestant household. Prayers in the morning, prayers in the evening, the reading of Scripture in the daily portions that the family had observed for generations, the close attention to the narrow moral lessons that the pastor delivered every Sunday, the whole accumulated atmosphere of a household in which religion was not a separate matter to be attended to on certain days, but was the simple, regular underlying texture of every day's underlying routine. Elisabeth Albertine absorbed this atmosphere completely. By the time she was 12, the limited, thoughtful Lutheran piety of her mother was the spare, measured Lutheran piety of her own. By the time she was 15, she had read the New Testament in German many times over, had memorized substantial portions of the Lutheran hymnal, and had developed the restrained private devotional habits that would remain with her for the rest of her life. The piety was not in her, a performance. It was simply who she was. The mother had taught her well. The teaching had taken. Her own studies in those teenage years expanded considerably. She began, at 13, to read more seriously in French. Mademoiselle Dupré gave her the standard French texts that the period considered the proper preparation for a serious young woman, the fables of La Fontaine, selections from Madame de Sévigne's letters, with the modest, attentive instructions in the polite letter-writing of the French aristocratic tradition, the deliberate moral writings of various French religious authors of the previous century. She began, at 14, to read the Latin classics in translation, in the plain accumulated way that princesses from that era sometimes did when their tutors were sufficiently learned to guide them through such material. She read Plutarch's Lives in a German translation that was kept in the duchy's minor library. She read Cicero's letters in the little selections that the period considered appropriate. She read, with particular attention, the Stoic writings of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, which her mother had directed her toward as containing, in the thoughtful way of pagan moral philosophy, useful preparation for the measured Christian living that the family expected of its daughters. She also, at this age, began to take a serious interest in music. The brief ducal court at Hildburghausen kept a faint chapel orchestra of perhaps 8 musicians who played at the family's services in the chapel and at the narrow social occasions that the court held. The leader of the orchestra was a man named Stuckel, who was also the duchy's music master, and he gave Elisabeth Albertine her first serious lessons on the harpsichord beginning when she was 11. By the time she was 16, she was a competent harpsichordist by the attentive standards from that era. capable of playing the little pieces of Bach and Telemann and the smaller German composers of the moment that the court music master considered the proper material for a princess of her age and station. She also sang in the deliberate contralto voice that her surviving family records describe in the simple hymn singing of the family's daily devotions and in the limited accumulated occasions when the court orchestra played for the family in the spare drawing rooms of the residence. She corresponded also with various of her relations over the empire in the restrained, thoughtful letter-writing apprenticeship that was one of the central educational practices of princesses of her rank. She wrote to her aunts in Urbach, on her mother's side. She wrote to her cousins in various other modest German courts to which the family was connected. She wrote, in due course, in French as well as in German, in the measured way that the period considered the proper accomplishment for a young woman of her station. The letters were corrected by her mother, in the attentive way that mothers from that era corrected their daughters' letters before they were sent out. The letters were returned, in due course, with the responses of the relatives, who themselves had been similarly trained as young women decades before. The whole network of deliberate correspondences that connected the women of the German princely houses to one another was, in this plain accumulated way, both the practice ground for Elisabeth Albertine's own later participation in such networks and the minor accumulated source of much of her wider information about the world beyond Hildburghausen. By 18 she was, in the little accumulated way of her education, very nearly a finished young woman. The serious piety, the competent French and German, the musical accomplishment, the thoughtful manners, the brief accumulated familiarity with the network of European princely correspondences, all of it had been laid down in the measured way of her mother's attentive management. By the time she was approximately the age that her own daughter Charlotte would be, when she eventually departed for England. Elisabeth Albertine herself, however, was not yet at the point of any equivalent departure. She would wait in the even way of unmarried princesses from that era, for the marriage that would eventually be arranged for her. The wait would be 4 more years. Those 4 years were, by the deliberate evidence of the surviving family papers, years of a faint accumulated calm at Hildburghausen. The court continued in its narrow accumulated routines. The family continued in its simple accumulated daily life. Elisabeth Albertine continued in her limited accumulated activities with the additional spare responsibility of beginning, in the way of older unmarried princesses of restrained German houses, to take on some of the modest social duties of the court. She represented her mother on plain social occasions when the Dowager Duchess could not herself be present. She took with her sisters minor thoughtful walks among the local nobility and little charitable visits to the families in the town. She participated in the brief way that older unmarried daughters of ducal houses participated, in the constant ceremonial life of the court, without yet having any independent position of her own. She was, in the measured way from that era, a young woman in waiting. She was waiting, although she did not know it, for the faint attentive arrival of the proposal that would, in 1735, take her away from Hildburghausen and into the long deliberate life that we have been describing. The town of Hildburghausen, in the years of Elisabeth Albertine's childhood, was the centre of the measured life of the duchy. It had a market square at its centre, a town hall, a parish church, a narrow school, perhaps a dozen streets of varying respectability radiating out from the centre, and the simple ducal residence on its slight rise at the eastern end. The town was, in the limited thoughtful way of spare German towns from that era, an entire restrained society in itself. The merchants who traded in the market knew the family of every household they served. The pastor of the parish church knew the names of every member of his congregation. The Hushed relationships of a modest town held the whole community together in the plain, intricate web of mutual familiarity that any minor town produces. The ducal residence stood at the centre of this web. The duke was the centre of the town's official life. The duchess was the centre of its little charitable activity. The children of the ducal family were known by sight to almost every resident of the town. When Elisabeth Albertine was taken out, in her later childhood, on the brief carriage rides that the family undertook in fine weather, the townspeople in the streets nodded and curtsied as the carriage passed. The princess, in turn, was taught by her mother to acknowledge the greetings with the faint measured nod of the head that the period required of princesses in such circumstances. The whole narrow daily ceremony of court and town was, in this still way, the daily reality of her childhood. She knew very few people, in any close sense, outside her own family and the immediate circle of the court. Her companions in childhood were her sisters and her brothers. Her subdued friendships were with the daughters of the few minor noble families who had estates near Hildburghausen and who visited the residence occasionally. She did not, in any meaningful sense, have a wider circle. The world she knew was simple. The world she would eventually have to enter was, by the standards of the world she knew, vast. She was, however, being prepared for that wider world from very early on. The limited attentive education that her mother and Mademoiselle Dupré gave her was, in the strict sense, an education designed for a princess who would eventually marry into another princely house, and would have to conduct herself in a strange court among strange people with the banked dignity that her birth required. The languages were useful, the deportment was useful, the music had its purpose. Even the spare, deliberate piety, which was in her own self genuine and personal, belonged to princess education, because it would help her to navigate the religious complexities that any inter-princely marriage involved. Marriage that would eventually be arranged for her was, in the modest, measured arithmetic of dynastic politics, not yet known. She could be matched with any of dozens of plain princes from over the empire. She could be sent, in theory, to any of the courts that her family was willing to consider. The choice would depend on a great many minor factors: the political alignments of the empire, the religious affiliations of the prospective husband's family, the little attentive negotiations over property and dowry, the hushed personal preferences of the various people involved. None of these factors were in any obvious sense in her own control. She would, when the time came, be told who she was to marry, and she would marry him. That was the brief fundamental fact of her future, and she was being raised in the faint deliberate awareness of it. The years passed in the narrow regular accumulation of a princess's childhood. The simple daily routines, the limited annual ceremonies, the spare festivals of the Lutheran year, Christmas with its restrained, thoughtful family celebrations and its still traditions, Easter with its subdued solemnities, the modest summer journeys to other ducal residences in the region, where the children of various plain princely families met one another in the minor measured occasions that princely visits provided. The little autumns at Hildburghausen, with the harvest and the squat economic anxieties that the duchy's brief revenues always produced. The faint winters, with the snow on the subdued hills and the hushed indoor activities that the season required. By the time Elisabeth Albertine was 20, she had become an accomplished woman in the narrow attentive way that the period valued. She was tall by the standards of the time, and slim with the simple dark hair and the limited grave expression that the surviving portraits of her preserve. She was not, by the standards of the 18th century, a great beauty. She was, however, a woman of considerable presence. She had the still dignity of a princess who had been raised by a devoted mother in a disciplined household. She had the subdued cultivation of a young woman who had read earnest and played music, disciplined and corresponded devout with her relations over the empire. She had the subdued piety of a Lutheran princess for whom religion was not a performance but a daily reality. She was, in short, the spare, deliberate product of her mother's meticulous work, and she was ready, in the restrained, thoughtful arithmetic of princess education, for whatever the next stage of her life would prove to be. The next stage arrived in 1735. She was 22. The man chosen for her was Charles Louis Frederick, a prince of the modest North German duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He was 27. He was the younger brother of the reigning duke. He was not, in any obvious sense, a brilliant match. The duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was plain, even by the standards of minor German duchies. The cadet branch into which she was marrying was, by definition, the secondary line of the family. He had no obvious prospect of inheriting the duchy himself. He was, in the little measured arithmetic of princely matches, an even and respectable husband for a princess of her rank, but not a glittering one. The marriage was, in essence, the marriage of two brief German princely houses, arranging the constant continuation of their hushed alliances. She accepted the match in the faint attentive manner that the period required. There is no record, in the narrow deliberate family papers, of any particular enthusiasm or any particular reluctance on her part. She had been raised in the simple, thoughtful awareness that her marriage would be arranged for her. The arrangement, when it came, was within the limited acceptable range of what she had been prepared for. She did what such young women did. She agreed. The wedding took place at Hildburghausen in May of 1735. The ceremony was conducted in the spare ducal chapel by the senior pastor of the duchy. The bride wore a dress of pale blue silk with restrained silver embroidery, made by the dressmaker who had served her mother for the previous 20 years. The groom wore the modest formal clothes of a German prince from that era. The two families and their still retainers gathered in the chapel. The plain measured ceremony was performed. The vows were exchanged in the minor attentive German that the period preferred for such occasions. The two were declared husband and wife. The little celebrations that followed lasted 3 days, in the subdued manner that brief German princely weddings traditionally required, after which the couple departed for their new home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She did not, in the strict sense, ever return to Hildburghausen. She would visit, of course, in the years that followed, on the faint, deliberate family occasions that princely families maintained. She would correspond with her parents and her siblings for the rest of her life, in the narrow, thoughtful letters that the period preserved and that the family's archives kept. But the home she had grown up in was, from the moment of her wedding, no longer her home. The simple measured world of her Thuringian childhood was, from May 1735, the limited attentive world of her past. The spare deliberate world of her future was now Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the restrained North German duchy where her new husband's family lived and where her own modest family would, in due course, be raised. The journey from Hildburghausen to her new home took the better part of 2 weeks, by the carriages from that era over the roads of central Germany. The new bride travelled with her husband and a plain retinue of attendants, including Mademoiselle Dupré, who had been engaged to continue in her service in the new household. They travelled north over the minor principalities of central Germany, through forests and little towns, and the deep landscape of the empire, in the brief thoughtful way that princely journeys from that era proceeded. They stayed, on the way, at the residences of various faint princely relations, who received them with the hushed hospitality that such occasions required. The journey was uncomfortable. The journey was long. The journey was, in the strict sense, the narrow measured transition by which a princess of one simple German house became a princess of another. She arrived in Mecklenburg-Strelitz in the late spring of 1735. The duchy lay in the flat northern lands of Germany, in what is now the very northeastern part of the modern country, near the Baltic coast. The landscape was unlike the landscape of her childhood. There were no muted forested hills. There were no narrow valleys. There were instead broad flat fields and limited lakes, and the still geography of the North German plain. The climate differed too. The summers were shorter. The winters were colder and longer. The whole subdued atmosphere of the place was unlike the lower atmosphere of Hildburghausen. The reigning duke, her husband's elder brother, was Adolphus Frederick III. He was in his early 60s at the time of the marriage. He had reigned for 27 years. He had no surviving male heirs from his marriage, which meant that his younger brother, Charles Louis Frederick, was the heir presumptive to the duchy. The succession, however, was not yet imminent. The duke was in reasonable health. He was expected to live for some years yet. The young couple, in the meantime, were to settle into the spare attentive position of the heir presumptive's family, with their own restrained establishment at the residence that had been assigned to them, which was Mirow. Mirow is a modest town in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, perhaps 30 miles to the southwest of Strelitz itself, which was the duchy's capital. It sits beside one of the plain lakes that the region is full of, in the kind of minor flat landscape that characterizes that whole part of Germany. The town in 1735 had perhaps a few hundred inhabitants. The ducal residence stood at the edge of the town, on a little rise overlooking the lake, in a building that was less a palace than a substantial country house. It had been used, in earlier generations, as the residence of various junior members of the Mecklenburg-Strelitz family. It had been refurbished in the early 18th century. It was modest but comfortable. It was not in any sense a grand building. This was now Elisabeth Albertine's home. She arrived at it in the brief, deliberate way of a new bride arriving at her new household, with her husband and her faint retinue, and the hushed baggage of a princess's establishment. The household at Mirow was narrow. There was a senior steward who had been managing the residence for some years. There was a simple staff of perhaps 15 servants in total. There was a chaplain who would conduct the family's daily Lutheran prayer in the limited chapel that adjoined the residence. There was a spare kitchen establishment. There was a restrained establishment of stables and outdoor staff. The whole household, taken in its full extent, was modest even by the standards of plain German princely establishments, and was in any case considerably smaller than the household at Hildburghausen, in which Elisabeth Albertine had grown up. She did not, however, find the smallness oppressive. She had been raised in a serious household where the still routines of the day were the substance of life, and the subdued routines of Mirow were not, in their fundamental shape, very different from those of Hildburghausen. The morning prayer in the minor chapel, the little thoughtful breakfast, the low activities of the day, the brief evening prayer, and the faint measured retiring to bed. The shape of the days at Mirow was the shape of the days at Hildburghausen, conducted with somewhat less ceremony and somewhat more privacy, but with the same fundamental structure and the same fundamental seriousness. The young bride, in the narrow attentive way she had been trained, settled into the new household and began the simple deliberate work of becoming its mistress. Her husband, Charles Louis Frederick, was a man of notable warmth and sizable kindness, although not, by the surviving accounts, of large force of character. He was, by the reports from that era, a hushed man. He was a man who took his duties seriously, but who did not, in any obvious sense, seek prominence. He had been raised in the limited, deliberate way of younger princes of spare German houses, with the restrained, thoughtful expectation that he would not himself reign, and that his life would instead be spent in the still activities of a junior member of the family. He had served briefly in the imperial army in his earlier years. He had returned to the duchy in his late 20s. He had been content, since his return, with the modest, measured life that the position offered him. The marriage to Elisabeth Albertine was, for him, the plain, attentive settling down that the position required. He was, by all accounts, sincerely fond of his new wife. The two of them, in the minor deliberate way of arranged ducal marriages from that era, settled into a relationship of considerable mutual respect and considerable mutual affection that would last for the rest of his life. The first years of the marriage at Mirow were the little thoughtful years of a new courtly household establishing itself. The young couple arranged the residence to their own taste, with the brief measured adjustments that any new household requires. Elisabeth Albertine, with her subdued experience of running a dynastic household from her years of helping her mother at Hildburghausen, took up the management of Mirow with a faint attentive confidence that the steward and the senior staff respected from the beginning. The low routines were established. The narrow, deliberate relationships with the local town and with the surrounding minor nobility were cultivated. The simple, thoughtful correspondence with relations over the empire was maintained. The household, within a year or two, had settled into the limited measured pattern that it would maintain, with various adjustments, for the next 17 years. The children began to arrive almost immediately. Christian came first, in November of 1735, only 6 months after the wedding. Caroline followed in 1736 and lived only a few months before burial in the Lutheran chapel at Mirow. Adolphus Frederick arrived in 1738 and would later become Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, then arranged Charlotte's marriage to the King of England. Elisabeth Christine came in 1739 and, like several siblings, died before adulthood. Sophia Albertine followed in 1740 and would in time become Abbess of Hereford. The pattern continued through the 1740s. Christine came in 1741 and died young. Charles, the second of twins, arrived that same year. Ernest Gottlob came in 1742 and died in infancy. Charlotte herself, the 8th surviving child, was born on the 19th of May in 1744. George Augustus, the youngest brother, arrived in 1748. 2 more infants followed Charlotte and died young in the tragedy of infant mortality that all 18th century families knew, even princely ones with the best medical attention the period could provide. The whole pattern of childbearing taken in its accumulated weight occupied the years from 1735 to about 1750. Elisabeth Albertine bore, in those 15 years, 10 children. Of those 10, 6 would survive to adulthood. The 4 who died in infancy or early childhood were buried, one by one, in the restrained Lutheran chapel at Mirow, in the regular way that the period accepted such losses. Each death was a private grief. The mother, who took her religious duties seriously, took her maternal griefs seriously also. There are, in the modest measured family papers, brief references to her sorrow at each of these losses. The papers do not dwell. The period did not encourage dwelling, but the sorrow was real, and it accumulated, in the plain attentive way of all such sorrows, in the woman who carried it. The children who lived grew up at Mirow under their mother's deliberate supervision. The household at Mirow was, throughout the 1740s, a household organized entirely around the children's upbringing. There was a nursery wing on the upper floor of the residence, where the youngest children lived under the care of nursery maids. There were minor schoolrooms on the floor below, where the older children took their lessons. There were tutors who came in from the town and from the wider duchy to teach the various subjects that princely children were expected to master. There was Mademoiselle Dupré, who had remained in Elisabeth Albertine's service since the marriage, and who taught the children French, and supervised their general education in the same way she had supervised Elisabeth Albertine's own education years before. The mother herself was, in this whole arrangement, the central figure, unlike many princely mothers from that era, who delegated the actual upbringing of their children almost entirely to governesses and tutors, and saw their offspring only on little ceremonial occasions. Elisabeth Albertine took an active personal role in her children's education. She visited the schoolrooms regularly. She knew what her children were studying. She quizzed them, in the brief, thoughtful manner of an attentive mother, on what they had learned. She supervised the patient work of their religious education with particular care. The Lutheran piety that had been her own mother's gift to her was in turn her own gift to her children. By the time Charlotte was 10, she had, like her mother before her, read the New Testament in German many times over, and had developed the still devotional habits that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The mother also took an active interest in her children's intellectual development. She corresponded with relations over the empire about books that they recommended. She acquired works of moral philosophy, of natural history, of botany, of music theory, for the subdued library at Mirow. She read these works herself and discussed them with her older children. She introduced her daughters in particular to the faint, measured intellectual culture that the period considered appropriate for princesses, with the narrow additional emphasis on serious study that had been her own mother's particular contribution to her own upbringing. The girls of Mirow grew up, in this low way, in a household where serious reading was considered the natural daily occupation of a princess, and where the simple, attentive, intellectual life was the limited, deliberate texture of every day. In 1749, when Charlotte was 5, the mother engaged a new tutor for her older children. The new tutor was a woman of considerable accomplishment. Her name was Magdalena Salomea de Grabo. She was the wife of a Mecklenburg pastor. She was known over the duchy and beyond it as a woman of unusual learning, who had translated works from French and Italian, and had written poetry of her own that had been published and admired. She was sometimes called, by her admirers in the spare literary circles of the region, the German Sappho. She came to Mirow on the recommendation of one of Elisabeth Albertine's correspondents, and she was engaged to give the older girls of the family particular attention in literature and languages. Madame de Grabo, as she was called by the family, would be one of the most consequential figures in Charlotte's education. She came to Mirow as a regular visiting tutor, several days a week, for many years. She gave the older Mecklenburg-Strelitz daughters a level of literary instruction that was, by the standards from that era, unusual for princesses of restrained German houses. She taught them not just the language and grammar, but the literature itself. She had them read serious works in French and German. She had them write essays on the works they read. She introduced them to the intellectual life of the European Enlightenment in the modest, thoughtful Protestant version that the period preferred. By the time Charlotte was 13, and Madame de Grabo was the central figure in her schoolroom, the plain foundations of Charlotte's lifelong intellectual seriousness had been laid by this remarkable woman, working under the measured supervision of Charlotte's even more remarkable mother. It is worth lingering for a moment on Madame de Grabo herself, because she was, in the modest way of her own life, an extraordinary woman, and her presence in the schoolroom at Mirow was one of the more unusual features of Charlotte's upbringing. She had been born around 1715 in Mecklenburg, the daughter of a Lutheran pastor who had given her, in her own girlhood, the kind of serious classical and modern language education that German Lutheran clergy of his stamp sometimes gave to their daughters when their daughters showed promise. She had married another Lutheran pastor in her early 20s, and the marriage had been, by the accounts that survive, both affectionate and intellectually companionable. Her husband had encouraged her writing. He had not, as some husbands from that era would have, required her to lay aside her studies upon marriage. He had instead treated her as a partner in his own intellectual life, and the household they kept together was, by the standards of country pastors' households from that era, unusually cultivated. She had begun translating in her late 20s, working from French and Italian into German, on works of moral philosophy and religious devotion. The translations had been published. They had been admired. By her 30s, she was being mentioned in the minor literary circles of North Germany as a woman of unusual gifts. She had also begun writing original verse, devotional poetry mostly in the German Lutheran tradition, that produced such work in considerable quantity in the period, but verse of a more refined and learned character than most of the work that the tradition produced. The label of German Sappho, when it was attached to her, was a label of considerable respect, although it would have astonished her to know it would still be remembered nearly 3 centuries later. Her engagement at Mirow came, in 1749, through the network of correspondences that linked the serious Protestant women of the region to one another. Elisabeth Albertine had been corresponding with various of these women for some years, exchanging recommendations of books and tutors, and the little attentive intelligence about the broader culture of Protestant Germany that such women shared with one another. Madame de Grabow's name had come up in this network. Elisabeth Albertine had written to her, had received a deliberate and intelligent reply, had pursued the matter further. The arrangement had been agreed. Madame de Grabow would come to Mirow 3 days a week, beginning in the spring of 1749, to give the older daughters of the household particular instruction in literature and languages. The schoolroom at Mirow in those years was, by the standards of any brief German princely residence from that era, an unusually serious place. It was on the upper floor of the central block, a room of perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a row of faint windows looking out over the gardens at the back of the residence and the lake beyond. The walls were painted a pale stone colour. The floor was of polished wood. There was a long oak table down the centre of the room, around which the children sat for their lessons, with chairs on both sides. There was a smaller writing desk at one end, where the tutor of the moment would sit. There was a narrow bookcase on one wall, containing the books that the children were currently studying, with the larger collection kept in the family library on the ground floor and brought up as needed. When Madame de Grabow was in residence, which was on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays through most of the years from 1749 to 1761, the schoolroom took on her particular character. She would arrive at about 9 in the morning, having been driven from her own house in the nearby village in the simple carriage that the family maintained for the purpose. She would be greeted by Elisabeth Albertine in the modest parlour where the family received its visitors. She would take a limited refreshment in the polite way from that era. She would then proceed to the schoolroom where the older girls would be waiting for her, and the lessons would begin. The lessons themselves had a particular shape. They began with a brief discussion of what had been studied in the previous session, conducted in French, in which the girls were expected to demonstrate their continuing command of what they had read. They proceeded then to the new material, which Madame de Grabow would introduce by reading aloud from the text in the original language, and then translating, line by line, with explanations of the spare grammatical and rhetorical points that the text presented. She would then have one of the girls read the same passage aloud, in turn, with corrections offered as needed. She would then set them a restrained written exercise, which they would complete during the remainder of the morning under her supervision, with her offering modest, thoughtful commentary as they wrote. The texts assigned to them were not, in any sense, the standard light reading that the period considered appropriate for young women of their station. Madame de Grabbeau gave them demanding work, Fenelon's Telemark in French with discussion of its political and moral implications, Racine's tragedies with attention to classical French verse, selections from Voltaire's historical writings interpreted through a Protestant schoolroom, works of moral philosophy by German and French authors, German poets from that era, and in due course, large portions of Lutheran devotional literature, treated for its literary qualities as well as its religious content. Charlotte, in particular, was the student who took to all of this with the most evident enthusiasm. By the time she was 14, she could discuss Fenelon and Racine with considerable fluency in French. She could write a thoughtful essay in either German or French on a brief philosophical question. She had committed to memory substantial portions of the German Lutheran hymnal and various selections of devotional verse. She was, by the faint measured judgment of Madame de Grabbeau, the most promising student the schoolroom had produced. The judgment was conveyed, in the narrow, attentive way that such judgments were conveyed, to Elisabeth Albertine in the simple private conversations that the mother and the tutor conducted at the end of each lesson day. The mother was pleased. The mother was, in the limited reserved way that her own seriousness permitted, deeply pleased. Her youngest surviving daughter was becoming, under Madame de Grabbeau's eye, the kind of earnest, cultivated young woman that Elisabeth Albertine had always hoped she would become. The relationship between Charlotte and Madame de Grabbeau, across these years, was the relationship of a disciplined teacher with a devout student. It was warm. It was respectful. It was conducted, on both sides, with the deliberate seriousness that both of them considered the proper attitude toward learning. Madame de Grabbeau was not a flashy teacher. She did not flatter her students. She did not allow them to think themselves more accomplished than they actually were. She corrected mistakes. She required revision. She held them to a thoughtful standard. The standard, when it was met with the measured approval that her own seriousness produced, and the approval was, for Charlotte, one of the spare particular pleasures of those years. Madame de Grabbeau continued at Mirow until 1761, when Charlotte's departure for England brought her connection with the family to its natural close. She would not travel to England with Charlotte. She was now in her mid-40s, with her own household to maintain, and she had no wish to leave Mecklenburg. The family arranged an attentive pension for her in recognition of her years of service. She returned to her own house in the village. She would correspond with Charlotte, in the years that followed, in the way of educated former tutors who had trained royal pupils, with the restrained, deliberate tact that the situation required, and Charlotte would respond with the affection of a former student who had not forgotten what she had learned. The correspondence was restrained. It was warm. It was, in the way of such correspondences, the unshowy, thoughtful continuation of a relationship that had once been daily and was now, by the plain geographic separation, reduced to minor periodic exchanges. Madame de Grabbeau died in 1768, 7 years after Charlotte's departure. Charlotte received the news in England with the little private grief of a woman losing one of the central teachers of her childhood. She made by the brief measured evidence that survives particular arrangements for the plain portion of Madame de Grabbeau's correspondence with her that she had retained, having it bound into a faint volume and kept in her private library at Buckingham House for the rest of her life. The narrow volume was, in the simple attentive way of such volumes, one of the limited physical connections that Charlotte maintained with the world she had left behind. The mother also paid thoughtful attention to the practical skills that her daughters would need in their eventual adult lives. There was needlework in the daily practice that all 18th century women, including princesses, were expected to maintain. There was music, with regular harpsichord lessons from a local musician and regular vocal lessons from another. There was deportment, in the spare, deliberate daily attentions that Mademoiselle Dupré supervised. There was the restrained, thoughtful household management that Elisabeth Albertine herself taught her older daughters, in the hushed apprenticeship that prepared them for the management of their own future households. This whole accumulated education was conducted, throughout, in the modest atmosphere of measured Lutheran piety that was the foundation of everything else. The day at Mirow began with morning prayer in the chapel. The day ended with evening prayer in the same chapel. The Sundays were observed with the plain attentive seriousness that the family considered proper. The festivals of the Lutheran year were marked with the still traditions that the family maintained. The whole life of the household, from the moment any child was woken in the morning to the moment any child fell asleep at night, was conducted within the minor even framework of the family's faith. Charlotte was, in this whole arrangement, the 8th surviving child and the 5th surviving daughter. She arrived in 1744 into a household that was already substantially established, with older brothers and sisters in the schoolroom, and with the subdued family routines already in place. She was, by the reports that survive, a low child. She was not a striking child in any obvious sense. She was the little deliberate younger daughter of a serious household who took her place in the hushed rhythms of the family with the brief, thoughtful seriousness that her mother encouraged in all her children. She was particularly close, from her earliest years, to her sister Christiane. Christiane was 9 years older than Charlotte, which is to say that by the time Charlotte was old enough to remember anything, Christiane was already a young woman in her late teens. The age difference, however, did not prevent the still closeness that developed between them. Christiane, who would never marry and who would remain at Mirow for the rest of her life, took a particular interest in her youngest surviving sister. She read with her. She walked with her in the walled gardens of the residence. She corresponded with her, in the years to come, with the faint, measured regularity that defined their relationship for the rest of their lives. Charlotte was also close to her brother Adolphus Frederick, who was 6 years older than her. Adolphus Frederick, as the eldest surviving son, was being prepared from his earliest years for the narrow possibility that he would one day inherit the duchy. He took his own education with great seriousness. He was, by the subdued reports, a kind older brother to his younger sisters, including Charlotte. He took an interest in their progress in the schoolroom. He included them, when he could, in the simple social activities that his own age and station permitted. He was, in the constant way of the family, the older brother to whom Charlotte looked up in the limited attentive manner that the period encouraged. The relationship between Charlotte and her mother was, by all accounts, particularly close. The mother had watched Charlotte's older sisters grow up and had supervised their education in the spare, deliberate way that her household maintained. By the time Charlotte was reaching the age at which the most intensive part of a princess's education began, the mother had practice. She had refined her methods. She had, in the measured way that experienced parents do, learned what worked. Charlotte received, from her mother, the restrained, concentrated attention of a woman who had already done this several times, and who knew, by the time it was Charlotte's turn, exactly how to do it. The modest daily routines that defined Charlotte's childhood at Mirow were, by the standards from that era, unusual in their seriousness and in their warmth. The Elisabeth Albertine was strict and demanding. She was also, as the surviving documents make clear, strongly affectionate, fully involved, and profoundly concerned with the interior life of each child, as well as with the outward accomplishments of their education. Charlotte, in her later life, would speak of her in terms that were, by the little reserved standards of 18th century princesses talking about their parents, unusually warm. She loved her mother. She knew her mother loved her. The low certainty of that love was, in the brief ways that such certainties are, the faint, even foundation on which the rest of her life would be built. She would lose this foundation when she was 17. She would carry the memory of it into England in 1761 and would, in the narrow, thoughtful way that she had been taught, recreate as much of it as she could in the household she eventually established at Buckingham House and at Kew and at Windsor. The simple Lutheran piety that her mother had taught her would be the limited Lutheran piety she would maintain at the Anglican court. The spare measured intellectual seriousness that her mother had encouraged would be the restrained attentive intellectual seriousness she would maintain in her 4,000-volume library and in her modest literary correspondences and in her plain private circle of cultivated friends. The minor close attention to her own children's upbringing that her mother had modelled would be, with adjustments for the very different conditions of the English court, the little thoughtful attention that she would give to her own 15 children. She would carry her mother with her in the constant way that the well-loved children of well-loving mothers do, into every room of every English residence she ever inhabited. But all of that was still in the future. We are still in the year 1750 of our story, at Mirow, in the brief deliberate household of Elisabeth Albertine and Charles Louis Frederick, with the children all still alive and the mother still in her 30s, and the faint measured life of the household still in its narrow, thoughtful, unbroken pattern. Charlotte is 6, Christiane is 15, Adolphus Frederick is 12, the simple younger children, Sophia Albertine and Charles, are 9 and George Augustus is 2. The household is complete. The days are whole. The limited measured life of the family is at its entire extent. The change that would, in time, transform the family came in 1752. The reigning Duke at Strelitz, Adolphus Frederick III, who was now in his early 80s, died in early March of that year. The duchy passed, by the spare attentive arithmetic of dynastic succession, to his younger brother, Charles Louis Frederick. Elisabeth Albertine's husband, who had spent his entire adult life as a junior member of the family with no particular prospect of reigning, suddenly became the reigning Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The new Duke and his family did not immediately move to Strelitz, the duchy's capital. They were, in the meantime, still settled at Mirow. The plans for the move were being made. The arrangements at Strelitz were being prepared. The family expected, in the course of the year, to move to the larger residence in the capital and to take up the restrained ceremonial life that the position required. The move never happened. Charles Louis Frederick, who had inherited the duchy in March, fell ill in the late spring of the same year. The illness, by the descriptions that survive, was something of the lung, in the regular way that lung complaints carried off so many adults from that era. He weakened steadily through the summer. By the autumn, it was clear that he would not recover. He died on the 5th of June 1752, having reigned as Duke for less than 3 months. Elisabeth Albertine was 39 years old. She was the mother of the 6 surviving children of the marriage. She was, abruptly, the widow of a reigning duke. The duchy itself passed, by the modest, deliberate arithmetic of succession, to her eldest surviving son, Adolphus Frederick, who was 14. He was a minor. The duchy required a regent. The regent who was appointed by the plain, thoughtful arrangements of the family was the late Duke's brother, Adolphus Frederick IV's uncle, who would manage the duchy's affairs until his nephew came of age. The position of Elisabeth Albertine in this whole arrangement was, in the minor measured arithmetic of widowed dowager duchesses, somewhat ambiguous. She was the mother of the new duke. She had no formal political role in the duchy. She was, however, the central figure in the family. She was the person who had raised the new duke. She was the person who knew his character better than anyone. She was the person who, by the hushed weight of her own seriousness and her own intelligence, was best placed to guide him through the little attentive transition into his eventual majority. She made, in this period, one of the most consequential decisions of her life. She decided not to move to Strelitz. She decided not to take up the brief ceremonial position of the Dowager Duchess in the duchy's capital. She decided, instead, to remain at Mirow with the younger children. The new duke himself, her son Adolphus Frederick, would be moved to Strelitz, where he would be educated under the regent's supervision in the still arts of governance that he would need to learn. The younger children, however, including Charlotte, would continue their upbringing at Mirow under their mother's direct supervision. The decision shaped Charlotte's entire upbringing for the next 9 years, from the age of 8, when her father died, until the age of 17, when she left for England. Charlotte lived at Mirow with her widowed mother and her remaining unmarried sisters and the youngest brother. The household was smaller than it had been. The atmosphere was quieter. The subdued grief of the family was, in the faint, deliberate way of well-managed Lutheran households, contained but not denied. The mother continued the narrow, regular work of raising her children with the seriousness that had always defined her. The work continued, with the simple adjustment that the husband was no longer there to share it, in the low routines that the household had always maintained. The Mirow of those 9 years, from 1752 to 1761, was the Mirow that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life as the world she had grown up in. It was a smaller world than it had been when her father was alive. The household was reduced. The limited ceremonial life that had previously connected the family to the wider duchy was conducted, after 1752, mainly from Strelitz, where her brother was now the nominal centre of the duchy's affairs. Mirow, in this whole arrangement, became a quieter and more widowed establishment. It was a household of women and children, with the mother at its centre, and with the spare, thoughtful daily routines of education and prayer and patient work going on in the even way they had always gone on, but now without the restrained formal overlay that the husband and father had previously provided. Widowhood agreed with Elisabeth Albertine in some ways. She was, by temperament, a serious and reserved woman. The modest court life of a duchess, even of a plain duchy, had always been less natural to her than the minor measured private life of a serious mother. The widowhood released her, in some hushed way, from the little ritual obligations that had always sat slightly uneasily on her. It allowed her to concentrate, in the years after 1752, on the brief meticulous work that mattered most to her, which was the upbringing of her children. The smaller scale of the household, the reduced ceremonial calendar, the faint intensified focus on the children and their education. All of this suited her, in the constant way that certain widowhoods suited certain 17th and 18th century women, whose deepest interests had always been domestic and intellectual rather than ceremonial. The grief, of course, was real. She had been married to Charles Louis Frederick for 17 years. They had borne 10 children together, of whom 4 had died and 6 survived. They had built, together, the still household at Mirow that was the narrow daily texture of all their lives. His death, in the measured way that the deaths of long-married spouses do, removed one of the simple fundamental supports of the world she had been living in. The limited, attentive family papers, in the spare reserved way that the period preferred, do not dwell on her grief. But the grief was there, and it accumulated in the restrained, deliberate way of all such griefs in the woman who carried it. She managed it in the way she had been raised to manage all earnest things, with the modest, thoughtful Lutheran piety that her own mother had taught her, with the subdued routines of a disciplined household, with the plain, measured work of caring for her surviving children. The grief did not, in the reports of those years, ever overwhelm her. It was simply absorbed, in the minor measured way that devout people absorb such things, into the larger low texture of her life. She continued. She raised her children. She maintained the household. She corresponded with her relations. She read. She prayed. She did, in the regular way, what she had always done. Charlotte, in those years, was watching all of this. She was 8 when her father died, which is to say that she was old enough to remember him, but young enough that the larger part of her growing up would happen in the years after his death. Mother, who had been her central guide before 1752, was even more her central guide after. The hushed lessons that the mother taught in the years from 1752 to 1761 would become the still foundations of Charlotte's adult character. How to manage grief without being overwhelmed by it. How to maintain a serious household in difficult circumstances. How to provide intellectual and religious leadership for the people in your care, regardless of whether the official structures supported you or ignored you. How to be a serious woman in a world that did not always reward seriousness. All of this Charlotte learned by watching her mother, day by day, in the subdued apprenticeship of a daughter to a remarkable mother, in the little attentive years of their shared life at Mirow. The daily routines at Mirow in those 9 years would be the routines that Charlotte, in her later life, would speak of with the affection that people reserve for the brief worlds of their childhood. The morning prayer in the faint chapel adjoining the residence, the breakfast taken in the narrow dining room near the schoolrooms, the lessons through the morning with Madame de Grabeau on the days she came, and with the various other tutors on the days they came, the simple midday meal taken with the family, the low activities of the afternoon, which might include further lessons, or music practice, or the limited deliberate walks in the gardens of the residence, or the spare thoughtful supervised reading that the mother encouraged in the older girls, the early supper taken with the family, the evening prayer in the chapel, the restrained measured retiring to bed at an hour that was by the standards from that era fairly early. The modest gardens at Mirow were, by the hushed reports, one of the modest particular pleasures of Charlotte's childhood. The residence had a plain kitchen garden behind it, where vegetables and minor fruits for the household kitchen were grown by the gardener and his little staff. There was a brief pleasure garden in front of the residence, looking out over the faint lake at the edge of the town, with narrow flower beds and simple ornamental shrubs in the limited attentive arrangements that the period preferred. There was a spare wilder area beyond the formal pleasure garden, where the young plantings were being allowed to grow up into the restrained woodland that the family hoped would, in time, soften the eastern boundary of the residence's grounds. Charlotte walked in those years in all of these gardens with her mother and her sisters in the daily routines of the household. The still love of plants and gardens that would be one of her greatest pleasures in her English life began, in a modest, unself-conscious way, of all such early loves, in the neat gardens at Mirow under her mother's plain, deliberate guidance. The lake itself was the minor particular feature of the local landscape. It was not large, by the standards of larger lakes elsewhere. It was perhaps a mile long, narrow, in the little thoughtful shape that the lakes of Mecklenburg often have. It lay just at the foot of the brief rise on which the residence stood. The family did not, in the strict sense, swim in it, because the subdued decorum from that era did not encourage princesses to swim. They did, however, walk along its banks in fine weather. They watched the faint ducks and the narrow water birds that lived on it. They noted, in the even way of long-time residents, the simple seasonal changes of the lake's appearance, the way the surface looked in the morning mist, the way it looked when the wind was up, the way it looked frozen in winter. The lake was, in this low way, one of the limited permanent features of Charlotte's hushed childhood landscape, and she would carry the memory of it with her, like the memory of so much else from those years, into the very different landscapes of her English life. The town of Mirow itself, beyond the residence, was the still background of the family's daily life. It had perhaps 400 inhabitants. It had a market square, a parish church, a spare school, the subdued streets of any restrained North German town from that era. The townspeople knew the family. The family knew the townspeople in the modest, measured way that residents of plain German princely seats knew the population around them. There was the pastor at the parish church, who was in the years after 1752 also the family's chaplain. There were the minor merchants who supplied the household with the various little goods it required. There were the brief tradesmen whose work the household occasionally needed. There was the low population of the town, who attended the parish church on Sundays, and whose faint lives intersected, in the constant way, with the narrow lives of the family at the residence. Elisabeth Albertine took her duties to the town and the surrounding parish seriously. She visited the parish church regularly, not only for the simple attentive family services in the chapel of the residence, but also for the hushed public services where she would be seen by the townspeople and where her presence was understood, in the limited deliberate way from that era, to mean something to them. She supported the spare charitable activities of the parish, in the measured way that German Protestant noblewomen from that era considered the proper duty of their position. She attended, when there was illness in the town, to the restrained, thoughtful provision of modest comforts to the families affected. She conducted herself, in short, in the regular way of a serious dowager duchess of a plain German principality in the minor Lutheran tradition that her own mother had taught her. Charlotte, growing up in this little measured environment, absorbed all of it, the still relationships with the town, the brief attentive charitable activities, the subdued way of being a serious noblewoman in a faint German Protestant community. By the time she was 15, in 1759, she had been doing some of these low things for some years already in her own person, in the hushed apprenticeship that her mother had been training her for since she was old enough to walk. The still habits would, in time, transfer themselves, with adjustments, to her English life. The narrow charitable activities, the simple close attention to the religious life of her household, the subdued relationships with the people who served her, all of it had been learned at Mirow, under her mother's eye, in the daily routines of the limited German residence. Well, det really need to natten to begin. The years from 1752 to 1761 passed in this low way. The children grew up. The older sisters reached marriageable age. The elder Christiane did not in fact marry. She remained at Mirow with her mother throughout those years, and would remain at Strelitz, at her brother's court, after her mother's death and her sister's departure for England. She had, by all accounts, no particular wish to marry. She was, like her mother in some respects, an earnest and reserved woman who preferred the secluded life of a deliberate unmarried daughter to the hushed risks of an arranged princely marriage. The mother did not by all accounts press the matter. Christian stayed. The brother, Adolphus Frederick, came of age in the late 1750s and assumed the spare ceremonial responsibilities of the duchy in his own person. He was an even and disciplined young man, in the constant way that his mother had raised him. He took his duties devout. He was, by all accounts, devoted to his family, and he visited Mirow often in those years, in the measured way that the new duke maintained a restrained private connection with his mother and his unmarried siblings at the residence. He was, for the rest of his life, the modest, protective older brother to his younger sisters, and the affection that Charlotte felt for him in her childhood would be, in the years to come, one of the still reasons she trusted him so completely when, in 1761, he conveyed to her the plain, unexpected news of the marriage proposal that would change her life. The smaller children continued through their education. Sophia Albertine, who had always been devotional inclined, eventually decided to enter the Protestant Lutheran life by becoming the Abbess of Hereford, a position that had been held by various Protestant princesses of the empire over the centuries, and that combined church dignity with considerable independence. Charles, the younger brother, would in time enter the army, where he would serve with distinction in the Hanoverian forces and would eventually rise to considerable position. George Augustus, the youngest, would also enter military service. The various subdued futures of the children, in the regular way of princely families, were being arranged year by year in the low correspondences that the mother conducted with relations over the empire. For Charlotte, however, the future was not yet, in any specific sense, as she was the youngest surviving daughter. Her older sisters had either married or had decided not to marry. Christiane was settled at home. Sophia Albertine was settled in religious life. The mother had time, with Charlotte, to wait. She did not, in the years before 1761, actively pursue any particular match for her youngest daughter. Charlotte was being prepared, in the even way that all the daughters of the household had been prepared, for the possibility that some appropriate match might in time be found for her, but no specific match was yet in view. She was, in this whole arrangement, the youngest daughter who was, in the minor unhurried way of such youngest daughters, simply growing up under her mother's eye in the routines of the household, with her future, when it came, expected to arrive in due course. It is worth describing those routines in some detail, because they are the routines that shaped the character of the young woman who would, in 1761, walk into the role of Queen of England with the constant composure that startled the English court. The day at Mirow began at 6 in the summer and 7 in the winter, with one of the maids coming into the little bedrooms of the daughters to wake them. Charlotte and Christiane shared a brief bedroom on the upper floor of the central block, on the south-facing side of the residence, where the morning sun reached them first. The room was simple. There were 2 faint wooden beds against opposite walls, with curtains in the modest way that the household preferred. There was a single washstand by the window, with a basin and a jug that one of the maids had filled the previous evening. There was a narrow wardrobe in which the daughters kept their daily clothes. There was a simple writing table at which they did their letters and their schoolwork. The room was lit in the dark hours by a single candle in a holder by the bed. The daughters dressed themselves with the maid's help, in the thoughtful way that the period required. The clothes were modest by the standards of court dress, because the family did not, in its daily life at Mirow, have any occasion for the more elaborate clothes that princesses sometimes wore. The girls wore plain wool dresses in the cooler months, plain linen in the warmer. The hair was dressed simply, pinned up under a limited linen cap. The whole effect was of a young woman in the daily clothes of a serious German Protestant household, which was, in the strict sense, exactly what they were. They went down, after dressing, to the morning prayer in the spare chapel adjoining the residence. The chapel was reached by a door at the far end of the upper corridor, which opened onto a restrained staircase that descended directly into the chapel itself. The chapel was modest. It held perhaps 30 people. It had a wooden altar at its eastern end, with a plain cross above it, in the modest manner that the Lutheran tradition preferred for the chapels of minor princely houses. There were wooden benches for the family on one side, and for the household staff on the other, with the little organ at the back. The pastor of the parish church served also as the family's chaplain, and he conducted the morning prayer in the measured way that the family expected. The hymns were sung, the reading from Scripture was given, a prayer for the family and the duchy and the empire was offered. The whole ceremony took perhaps 20 minutes, and it was the ceremony every morning, in the measured way that such ceremonies went on in households of this kind for generations on end. After the prayer, the family went to breakfast in the dining room near the schoolrooms. Breakfast was modest. There was bread with butter from the family's own dairy. There was cheese from the source. There was milk, fresh from the morning's milking. There was sometimes a limited portion of fruit from the kitchen garden in season. There was tea or coffee in the modest portions that the household considered appropriate. The whole meal took perhaps half an hour, and it was conducted with the attentive manners that Elisabeth Albertine required of her children at all meals. They sat in their assigned places. They spoke when spoken to. They did not interrupt one another. They handled their utensils correctly. The whole faint structure of the meal was, in the way that such things were, a daily lesson in the manners that they would need for the rest of their lives. After breakfast the lessons began at 8 in the morning. They continued, with breaks, until the midday meal at 1. The afternoon was given over to other activities, music practice for an hour, a walk in the gardens for an hour, weather permitting, a period of reading or correspondence, a period of needlework. The afternoon ended with a faint light supper at 6, after which there was on most evenings a period of family gathering in the narrow drawing room. The mother read aloud. Sometimes the girls did embroidery while she read. The younger boys in their later years played hushed games or studied their lessons. The day ended with the evening prayer in the chapel at 9, after which the family retired to bed. This was the rhythm of life at Mirow. It varied with the seasons. It varied with the simple accumulated changes of the family over the years. It did not, in any fundamental way, ever change. The prayers in the chapel at the hours every day, the lessons in the schoolroom with the tutors at the times every week, familiar walks in the gardens, the usual readings in the drawing room, the pattern of life was fixed, regular, and predictable, as serious German Protestant households of that era tended to be. Charlotte absorbed this rhythm completely. The even regularity of the days at Mirow became the texture of her own internal sense of how a household should be run. When she eventually established her own household at Buckingham House and at Kew, in the years after her marriage in 1761, the rhythm she imposed on it was, with adjustments for the very different conditions of the English royal court, the rhythm she had absorbed at Mirow. Morning prayers, regular meals at fixed hours, the deliberate structuring of the day around its various limited activities, the thoughtful management of the household to maintain the regular pattern. The English servants who served her in the early years often remarked on the measured regularity she imposed. They had not always seen it before in royal households. It was, in any fundamental sense, the rhythm of Mirow transposed over the sea. The future, when it arrived in a way that no one in the household had anticipated. The story of how Charlotte was selected to be Queen of England is one of the still curiosities of 18th century dynastic politics, and it is worth telling here in some spare attentive detail, because it is the story of how Elisabeth Albertine's restrained, deliberate work, conducted across nearly 20 years at Mirow, with no particular thought of any English destiny, was suddenly brought into the subdued centre of European royal affairs. George II of England died on the 25th of October 1760. His grandson, who became George III at the age of 22, succeeded him. The new king was unmarried. he needed a queen. The political and religious requirements were considerable. She had to be a Protestant because the English succession was strictly limited to Protestants. She had to be of suitable royal rank, which meant the daughter of a reigning prince of the Holy Roman Empire or of a comparable European house. She had to be of an age that would permit her to bear children, which meant young, ideally between 16 and 20. She had to be, in the even way that mattered to George III in particular, of unblemished moral reputation. She had to be willing to come to England, learn English, accept the low obligations of an English queen consort, and live the rest of her life in a country she had probably never visited. The list of eligible princesses over the Protestant German states was, in the arithmetic of dynastic eligibility, considerably shorter than one might expect. Most of the obvious candidates were already engaged or married, or were too old or too young, or were affiliated with families whose political alignments were inconvenient for England. The English government, working through its diplomats in various German courts, conducted a modest, deliberate survey of the available candidates through the early months of 1761. The survey produced, in due course, a short list of perhaps half a dozen princesses who appeared, on paper, to meet the various requirements. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was on this short list, although not initially considered the most likely choice. The selection process was, in the constant way that it had always been conducted in such matters, a combination of formal diplomatic inquiry and informal personal observation. The English government dispatched, in the spring and early summer of 1761, a number of plain, thoughtful agents to various German courts to make minor measured observations of the eligible princesses. The agents reported back, in little attentive letters, on the appearance and the reputation and the family circumstances of each candidate. The reports were considered by the king and his ministers in a series of brief deliberate consultations through the spring. In the case of Charlotte, the faint watchful observations were conducted by a man named Colonel David Graham, who travelled to Strelitz in the summer of 1761 to make his assessment. He was received by Adolphus Frederick at the narrow ducal court in Strelitz. He was introduced, in the simple, thoughtful way that such introductions were managed, to Charlotte, who was brought from Mirow for the occasion. He observed her in the limited, orderly manner of all such observations, in the hushed, discreet inspection that the period considered appropriate. He returned to England with his report in early July. The report was favourable. Charlotte, in the spare, deliberate judgment of Colonel Graham, met the various requirements that the position involved. She was of suitable rank. She was Protestant in the restrained, solemn Lutheran tradition that the English court was prepared to accept. She was 17, which was the still ideal age. She was of unblemished moral reputation, which the modest, attentive observations of the colonel had confirmed. She was, in the plain, watchful judgment of the colonel, also of agreeable appearance, although not, by the standards of the minor thoughtful observation, a striking beauty. She was, by the reports that the colonel had gathered from various sources at Strelitz, an intelligent and well-educated young woman who would be, in his judgment, a suitable consort for the new king. The decision was made in early July. The king accepted the recommendation. The little orderly diplomatic machinery was set in motion. A formal marriage proposal was prepared, signed by the king, and dispatched to Strelitz with a subdued retinue that would, when the proposal was accepted, escort the bride back to England. The proposal arrived at Strelitz in the second week of July 1761. It was received by Adolphus Frederick, who was the brother and head of the family. He read the proposal with the low astonishment that the brief German princely houses tended to feel when proposals of such magnitude unexpectedly arrived. The Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was, by the arithmetic of European dynastic prestige, very far down the list of houses that might have expected to provide a Queen of England. The proposal was, in this whole arrangement, the hushed dynastic windfall that the family had not, in any concrete sense, anticipated. He communicated the news to his mother and to his sister immediately. The communication was, by the reports that survive, careful and considerate. He travelled to Mirow himself with the documents in his keeping and conveyed the news to his mother and Charlotte in person. The scene, in the faint, careful family rooms at Mirow on that summer afternoon in early July 1761, was the turning point of the family's history, and it is worth dwelling on it for a moment. Imagine the scene with me, whom you will. It is a warm afternoon in early July at Mirow. The lake at the foot of the narrow rise on which the residence stands is calm. The air is heavy with the simple heat of summer. The family is in the limited drawing room on the ground floor of the residence, where Elisabeth Albertine has come down for a few hours from her own private rooms upstairs, in the spare effort that her illness still permits her on the better days. Christiane is with her embroidery. Charlotte is with her, with a book. The younger brothers are out in the gardens or with their tutors elsewhere in the residence. The drawing room is still, in the slow afternoon way that drawing rooms in country residences are subdued on summer afternoons. The sound of carriages outside breaks the lull. There is, in the restrained, accumulated way that such things go, a modest commotion in the courtyard. Servants moving. The footman at the front door announcing the plain arrival. Adolphus Frederick has come from Strelitz. He has come unexpectedly. He has come with a minor retinue. He has come, the family infers immediately from the unannounced nature of the visit, with some specific purpose that has brought him from his own duchy on this particular afternoon. He comes into the drawing room. He is 23. He is, in the little particular way of his serious German prince's bearing, a watchful and considerate young man. He greets his mother. He greets his sisters. He kisses his mother's hand, in the thoughtful way from that era. He sits when she gestures him to a chair. The conversation begins, as such conversations always began, with the brief orderly inquiries about everyone's health. The mother responds deliberate. She is no worse, she says. She is not better. She is, in the measured way from that era, managing, he produces then, the documents. He has been carrying them, by the solemn evidence of the faint accumulated reports, in a narrow leather portfolio that he has brought with him from Strelitz. He explains, as he opens the portfolio, what they contain. The formal marriage proposal from George III of England, the watchful diplomatic letters that accompany it, the simple accumulated practical arrangements that the proposal anticipates. He reads, aloud, in the limited, thoughtful manner of a brother delivering momentous news to his mother and his sister, the central document. The mother listens. She sits in her chair by the window, in the chair she always sits in when she comes down to the drawing room in these difficult weeks. Her hands are folded in her lap. Her face is, by the orderly evidence of the surviving reports, composed. She is taking in what her son is reading. She is, in the regular way of her own serious nature, beginning, even as he reads, to think through the implications. Charlotte listens. She sits beside her mother, in the chair, where she always sits when she is keeping her mother company. Her book is closed now, in her lap. Her face is, by the reports, also still, although that stillness is, in her case, the stunned composure of a young woman who is not yet able to absorb what she is hearing. The proposal is for her. The proposal is for her marriage. The proposal is for her marriage to the King of England. The spare, watchful words that her brother is reading aloud are, in the restrained, accumulated arithmetic of her own life, the modest, thoughtful words that are about to change everything. Christiane listens. She sits over the room with her embroidery still in her hands, although she has stopped working. Her face is, by the same orderly reports, the most visibly affected of the three. She is 26. She is the elder sister. She has spent her whole life with this younger sister, whom she has been instrumental in raising. She is the person in the room who is, in some plain, hushed way, most immediately understanding what the proposal means. Her sister is going to leave. Her sister is going to a country over the sea. Her sister is, in any ordinary sense, never going to come back. The reading concludes. There is a minor silence. The mother speaks first. She thanks her son for bringing the news. She asks, in the careful way of her own seriousness, several specific questions about the travel arrangements. When would the journey be made? What would be the route? Who would accompany Charlotte? What would be the brief ceremonial arrangements at the English end? Who would be there to receive her? The questions are concrete. The questions are sensible. The questions are the questions that a serious mother, even on her sick bed, asks when her 17-year-old daughter has just been proposed to by the King of England. Adolphus Frederick answers as best he can. The journey would be made in August or September, when the faint arrangements have been completed. The route would be by carriage to Stade and then by ship to England. The accompanying party would include several senior German attendants and the escort that the English king has dispatched. The English ceremonial arrangements were, by the plain descriptions in the documents, considerable. The English king would meet her at the Palace of St. James upon her arrival. The wedding would be conducted within hours of the meeting by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the chapel of the same palace. The mother takes all of this in. She asks Charlotte then, the question that everyone in the room knows is the central question, whether Charlotte herself accepts the proposal. Charlotte, by the limited watchful reports, is silent for a moment. She looks at her mother, she looks at her brother, she looks back at her mother. She says, in the thoughtful way of a 17-year-old who has been raised to give the answer that her position requires, that she will accept the proposal if her mother and her brother think she should. The answer is not, in any obvious sense, an enthusiastic acceptance. It is also not, in any obvious sense, a reluctant one. It is, in the spare orderly way from that era, the answer that a serious princess gives when she is being asked to do what her family considers right for the family. She says yes, because the family has, in effect, said yes, and because she has been raised to give the answer that the family has, in effect, given. The mother accepts the answer. She nods. She speaks, then, with a restrained directness that the surviving reports preserve, of the importance of the marriage, and of the gravity with which Charlotte will need to undertake it. She speaks also of her own confidence in her daughter. Charlotte, she says, has been well raised. Charlotte will, in the plain way of a well-raised young woman, manage what she is being asked to manage. The mother's confidence in Charlotte, expressed in this minor afternoon conversation in the drawing-room at Mirow, is, by the surviving evidence, the little careful gift that her mother gives her in this moment. You can do this, the mother says, in effect. I have raised you to be able to do this. Go and do it. Charlotte, by the surviving reports, is greatly moved by this. She kneels beside her mother's chair and takes her mother's hand. The mother strokes her daughter's hair, in the careful way that mothers do. The brother, by the same reports, looks away, in the brief private way that brothers do when they witness intimate moments between mothers and daughters that are not, in any strict sense, theirs to participate in. The afternoon proceeds. The faint, careful, practical arrangements begin to be discussed. The brother stays for supper. The mother retires, after supper, back to her own private rooms upstairs. The day ends. The mother, Elisabeth Albertine, was at this point 48 years old. She was not, by the standards of her own family, an old woman. She was, however, not in robust health. She had been suffering, for some weeks before the news arrived, from some form of illness whose precise nature the family papers do not specify. The illness had been worsening through the early summer. By the time her son arrived with the news of the English proposal, she was already, in the narrow, careful judgment of those around her, seriously unwell. The arrival of the news, in this whole accumulated context, was the arrival of an extraordinary opportunity at the moment when the central figure in the family's life was no longer in any sustained physical position to manage it. She managed it anyway. The accumulated reports that survive of those weeks describe her conducting herself in the even way she had always conducted herself, with a simple, thoughtful attention to the still requirements of the situation. She received with her son the limited watchful retinue that the English king had sent. She conducted with her son the spare, thoughtful diplomatic conversations that the proposal required. She prepared with her son and with Charlotte the restrained, orderly response that the situation required. She supervised, in the steady way she had always supervised her household, the subdued practical arrangements that would be required for Charlotte's eventual departure for England. She did, in short, what she had always done. She managed. But she was, in this whole arrangement, conducting all of this from the low weakness of her illness. She was, by the second half of July, no longer leaving her own private rooms at Mirow, except on the most necessary occasions. She was receiving the English emissaries, when she received them, in her own apartments rather than in the modest ceremonial rooms of the residence where such interviews would normally have been conducted. She was, in the steady way of the situation, doing what was required by sheer force of will, with the plain physical reserves of a woman who knew, in the minor private way of such things, that her time was short. Charlotte, in this whole accumulated context, was watching her mother. She was 17 years old. She had spent her entire life under her mother's eye in the hushed routines of the household at Mirow. She had been raised by her mother in the still awareness that her marriage would in due course be arranged for her, and that she would, when the time came, accept whatever was arranged with the subdued grace that her position required. She had not anticipated, however, that the marriage that would be arranged for her would be the marriage to the King of England. She had not anticipated, even more, that the news of the marriage would arrive at the still moment when her mother was visibly failing. The two things, in the steady way that they arrived together, were difficult to absorb separately. She conducted herself, by all accounts, with the low grace that her mother had always taught her. She received the news with the little careful composure that the period required of princesses in such circumstances. She accepted, in the brief, careful conversations with her brother and her mother, the proposal that had been made. She agreed, in the steady way that the period expected, to undertake the journey to England and the marriage that awaited her there. She did, in short, what she had been raised to do. She accepted what was arranged, but she was, in this whole accumulated context, also watching her mother fade. The faint private grief of those weeks, conducted alongside the narrow public preparations for the most consequential journey of her life, must have been very considerable. The accumulated family papers, in the simple reserved way that the period preferred, do not describe Charlotte's emotional state in any detail. The accumulated papers do, however, contain the limited careful evidence that Charlotte spent as much time as the preparations permitted at her mother's bedside in those last weeks. She read to her. She prayed with her. She sat, in the steady way of attentive daughters, in the spare private rooms where her mother was spending the last weeks of her life. The mother, for her part, used those weeks to do what serious dying mothers have always done with their nearly grown daughters. She spoke to Charlotte at length. She gave her, in the steady way of such conversations, the final teachings that she would not be there to give in the years to come. The conversations were not recorded. We do not know, in any direct sense, what was said in those restrained private hours at Mirow in July of 1761. We know only that the conversations took place, and that Charlotte, in the years to come, would refer to her mother's last teachings with the reverence that the period reserved for the deathbed counsel of the people one had most loved. But we can imagine, with reasonable confidence, the kinds of things that would have been said. Picture the modest private bedroom where Elisabeth Albertine was now spending almost all of her time. It was on the upper floor of the central block, on the south-facing side, with 2 plain windows looking out over the gardens. The bed was a curtained 4-poster of the modest German type, with hangings of pale blue linen that the family had made some years before. The walls of the room were panelled in pale wood. There was a minor writing desk by one window. There was a little wardrobe along one wall. There was a brief fireplace, which was now, in the summer months, unused. There was a single armchair drawn up close to the bed, where the person currently keeping the mother company would sit. The room was hushed and faint and intensely familiar to all the members of the family who had spent their childhoods at Mirow. Charlotte spent, by all accounts, the better part of every afternoon in that armchair through the second half of June and the first days of July. She came up after the midday meal and sat beside Elisabeth Albertine. When the invalid was alert enough to listen, Charlotte opened the German devotional works her parent had loved for years. Sometimes she used the Lutheran hymnal. Sometimes she chose the moral philosophy they had studied together. When longer passages were too much, she turned to the daily devotional selections prescribed by the Lutheran tradition. The words were given in a careful voice, as she had been taught to speak aloud, and they filled the limited quiet of the bedroom in those final weeks. When Elisabeth Albertine was alert, she spoke at length. She spoke about Charlotte's coming life in England, about leaving Germany, about marrying a man Charlotte had never met, and about the sober attention with which Charlotte would need to undertake the position. She warned her daughter about the restrained dangers involved. She spoke, too, about carrying her religion with her, being kind to the people who would be placed in her service, and bearing her children, when they came, with the same discipline in which she herself had been raised. In short, she tried to give Charlotte everything a mother might want her daughter to carry into the position of Queen of England. Charlotte listened. She wept, sometimes, in the modest, careful way that the period permitted weeping in such circumstances. She nodded. She held her mother's hand. She sometimes, in the plain intervals of the conversation, pressed her cheek against her mother's hand, in the minor gesture of a daughter who is trying to absorb into her own physical memory the touch of a hand that she will not, in any practical sense, ever feel again. There was one conversation that the surviving fragmentary evidence preserves, in the modest way such things are preserved over the centuries. It took place by the watchful reports on an afternoon in the second week of June. The mother was alert, that afternoon, more so than she had been for some days. She asked Charlotte to come close to the bed. She asked Charlotte to listen thoughtful. She told Charlotte then, in the steady, orderly way that her own seriousness produced, that she had been thinking about what she most wanted Charlotte to remember when she was, in the years to come, in difficult circumstances in England. The thing she most wanted Charlotte to remember was this, that she had been loved, that she had been raised watchful, that she had been given, by her mother, the foundation she would need to manage whatever came, that she should not, in the difficult moments, ever forget that the mother who had raised her had loved her completely. The mother said this. The daughter, by the thoughtful reports, wept openly, and the mother stroked her hair with the orderly tenderness of a woman who knew she was conducting one of the last conversations she would ever have with the daughter she most loved. There were other such conversations. They were not all so explicit. They were not all so dramatic. Most were the subdued exchanges of an attentive daughter sitting beside a dying parent across the slow afternoons of a summer of decline. Elisabeth Albertine and Charlotte spoke about ordinary things, the garden, the weather, the little accumulated news of the household. Elisabeth Albertine asked Charlotte to remember the canary kept in a cage by the window. Charlotte promised. She asked Charlotte to write to Christiane after she had gone to England, because Christiane would be lonely without her sister, and the letters would help. Charlotte promised. She asked Charlotte to say her evening prayers every night, even in England, even when she was tired. Charlotte promised. The accumulated weight of those faint promises, exchanged in the low bedroom at Mirow, was the weight of a daughter accepting final instructions from a parent who would not be there to enforce them. By the last days, the mother was no longer always alert. She slept much of the day. She woke in fits. She spoke when she spoke, in the spare, disconnected fragments that the dying speak in. She mentioned her own mother sometimes, who had been dead for many years. She mentioned her husband, who had been dead for 9. She mentioned, in the strange wandering way of the dying, scenes from her childhood at Hildburghausen that Charlotte had never heard her speak of in any detail before. The walls of her own old nursery, the restrained, chosen curtains that had hung in the modest given schoolroom of her own girlhood, the plain single face of the French governess who had taught her in those years. Charlotte listened to all of it, in the steady way of attentive daughters at the bedsides of the dying, taking in the minor accumulated final glimpses of the woman her mother had been before she was anyone's mother. The death came in the first days of July. The exact date is recorded variously in different sources. The most reliable date is the 29th of June 1761, although some accounts give a date in July. What is certain is that Elisabeth Albertine died at Mirow, in the little private rooms where she had been confined for the final weeks of her illness, in the summer of 1761, surrounded by her surviving children and the brief attendance of her household. Her last hours were, by the reports that survive, peaceful. She had taken the Lutheran sacraments in the steady way that the period required. She had spoken to each of her children. She had given to her surviving family the hushed last words that the period considered the proper conclusion of a Christian death. She had then, in the steady way, simply died. She was 48 years old. She had been a widow for 9 years. She had been a mother for 26 years. She was buried, in the still days that followed, in the faint Lutheran chapel at Mirow that her husband had been buried in 9 years before. The narrow, watchful funeral, conducted by the parish pastor, was attended by the family and the subdued dignitaries of the duchy who travelled to Mirow for the occasion. The whole simple ceremony was conducted in the steady way that the family preferred, with the limited, thoughtful Lutheran simplicity that her own piety would have required. There were no extravagant displays. There was no elaborate funerary monument. There was the spare, orderly ceremony, the restrained, deliberate prayers, the solemn committal of the body to the chapel, and the low grief of the family who remained. The funeral itself, by the evidence of the surviving accounts, was conducted on a Sunday in early July. The chapel, small as it was filled to capacity with the family, the senior household staff, the senior dignitaries of the duchy who had travelled from Strelitz for the occasion, and the senior representatives of the parish church and the wider Lutheran establishment of the region. The pastor who conducted the service was the same man who had conducted the family's daily prayers for some years in the steady way that family chaplains served their families across long stretches of time. He had known Elisabeth Albertine well. He had attended her in her last illness. He had administered the final sacraments. He delivered, now, the deliberate funeral sermon that the period considered the proper conclusion of a Christian life. The sermon was on a text from the Lutheran tradition that the family had agreed upon in conversation with the pastor in the days before the service. The text was from the Psalms, in the solemn way that Lutheran funeral sermons of the period often took their texts from the Psalms. The sermon was modest. It did not, in the orderly way of Lutheran practice, dwell unduly on the minor particular merits of the deceased. It dwelt instead on the attentive theological themes of mortality and resurrection that the tradition required. It was, in the attentive way, the right kind of sermon for the woman it commemorated. The body was placed in a coffin of plain dark wood in the modest manner that the family preferred. The coffin was lowered into an unassuming vault beneath the floor of the chapel, where it was placed beside the coffin of Charles Louis Frederick, who had been buried there 9 years before. The vault was then sealed. A limited marble slab was placed over the spot, with the deliberate inscription that the family had agreed on. The inscription gave her name, her dates, her position as the Dowager Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and the measured Lutheran formula of commemoration that the period required for such monuments. The slab was, in the solemn way of such things, modest. It did not draw attention to itself. It marked the spot quietly, in the way that the woman it commemorated would have preferred. The family, after the service, gathered for a minor subdued meal in the residence, in the unassuming accumulated way that German Protestant families of the period held the limited reception that customarily followed a funeral. The conversation was low. The food was modest. The whole atmosphere was, by the surviving careful descriptions, the combination of grief and steady acceptance that serious German Protestants brought to such occasions. They had lost a beloved member of their family. They were also, in the discipline of their tradition, not unduly disturbed by the loss in any theological sense, because their faith taught them to expect such losses and to receive them with the equanimity that the faith prescribed. The grief was real. The grief was contained. Both things were, in the pattern, true at once. Charlotte, throughout this whole accumulated period, conducted herself with the hushed grace that her mother had taught her. She attended her mother's deathbed. She participated with her brother and her sisters in the careful arrangements for the funeral. She received, in the habit that the period required, the deliberate condolences of the various dignitaries who came to Mirow for the ceremony. She did, in short, what was required of her. She did it, by all accounts, with the still dignity that her position required. But she was, in this whole accumulated context, also 17 years old. She had just lost her mother. She was about to leave, within weeks, for a country she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met. The subdued weight of these circumstances, falling all at once in the low days of late June and early July 1761, must have been very considerable. The accumulated family papers, in the small reserved way that the period preferred, do not describe her emotional state in any detail. The accumulated papers do, however, contain the attentive evidence that she conducted the hushed practical preparations for her departure with the measured efficiency that the situation required, and that she did so without any of the still lapses or breakdowns that might have been forgiven, even by the small reserved standards of the period, in a young woman in such circumstances. The preparations for the departure were, by the standards of the period, considerable. The wedding party that would escort Charlotte to England was being assembled. The subdued trousseau that the period required of a royal bride was being prepared. by the patient work of a number of seamstresses and dressmakers in Strelitz and the surrounding region. The careful diplomatic arrangements for the journey were being conducted by the English ambassador in conjunction with Adolphus Frederick. The low correspondence with the English court was being maintained in the steady way that the situation required. Charlotte herself, in the weeks between her mother's death and her own departure, was conducting the final tasks of preparing herself for the journey. She was practicing her English, which she had only recently begun to learn, and which she would need urgently in the months to come. She was being instructed, in the steady way that the period required, in the hushed protocols of the English court that she would need to understand. She was reviewing, with her brother, the still diplomatic and political arrangements that her marriage would involve. She was, in short, finishing her education. The mother who had begun the education in 1744 had by the patient work of 17 years raised her to the point where this final concentrated finishing was possible. The finishing, in the subdued weeks of July and early August 1761, was conducted in the deliberate awareness that the mother was no longer there to oversee it. The departure was set for the 17th of August. Charlotte was, on that day, to leave Mirow for Strelitz. From Strelitz, she would travel with the wedding party to Stade, on the German coast, where she would board the English ship that would convey her to England. The journey from Mirow to Stade would take, by the carriages of the period, approximately a week. The voyage from Stade to England would take, depending on the low weather, between several days and several weeks. The whole journey, in the arithmetic of 18th century travel, was a journey that would extract her completely from the hushed world of her childhood, and would set her down completely in the still world of her future. The morning of the 17th of August was overcast at Mirow. The subdued reports of that morning describe an attentive gathering at the residence of the family and the low retainers who had come to bid Charlotte farewell. Adolphus Frederick was there. Christian was there. Sophia Albertine was there. The younger brothers Charles and George Augustus were there. Madame de Grabeau, who had taught Charlotte for years and who would not be travelling to England with her, was there. Mademoiselle Dupré, who had been with the family for 30 years and who was now too old to travel, was there. The hushed household of Mirow, the senior staff and the long-serving servants and the still population of the residence were all there. Charlotte herself, on that morning, said her careful farewells to each of them in turn. She embraced her brother, she embraced her sisters, she embraced her younger brothers. She received from each of them the deliberate farewell that the period required and the subdued personal grief that the situation invited. She did, in this low way, what such departing princesses had always done. She left them all behind. The last farewell was the attentive visit to her mother's tomb in the Lutheran chapel adjoining the residence. She went there alone. She knelt before the marble slab that marked the grave. She prayed for the time the situation required. Then she rose, left the chapel, and walked back through the courtyard to the waiting coach. She climbed in. The wedding party that would accompany her to Strelitz entered the vehicles behind her. Farewells were said for the last time through open windows. The little procession began to move. The subdued assembly in the courtyard waved. The coaches turned out onto the intimate road that led north towards Strelitz. The retinue moved up the minor road through the low landscape of the duchy at the pace such journeys required. And Charlotte, by all accounts, did not look back. Almost halfway through tonight's story, let us pause for a moment before we follow Charlotte across the sea and dwell on the hushed meaning of what has just been described, because the still departure that we have just witnessed was, in the deliberate arithmetic of Charlotte's life, The moment at which everything her mother had taught her was about to be tested in conditions that her mother had never anticipated and would not be there to support her through. Elisabeth Albertine, dying at 48 in the subdued of Mirow in late June 1761, had given her 17-year-old daughter the low foundation of an earnest life, the Lutheran piety, the disciplined intellectual habits, the low close attention to the hushed duties of a princess, the unassuming thoughtful attention to the still needs of the people in her care, the subdued grace under the low pressures of difficult circumstances, the hushed capacity to maintain a household in the attentive way that devout households are maintained. All of this Charlotte was now carrying, in the steady way that well-raised daughters carry their mother's teachings, into a country where almost none of the people she would meet had ever known the woman who had taught her. This is, in some still way, the most poignant aspect of Charlotte's English life. The mother who had made her was not there to be referenced. The mother who had given her everything that mattered most in her character was not there to be praised or quoted or visited. The mother existed, in the steady way of dead mothers, only in Charlotte's own private memory. The English court would never have any direct sense of Elisabeth Albertine. The English court would only ever know Charlotte herself, the subdued product of her mother's work, without the low context of the woman whose work it had been. Charlotte herself, by all accounts, kept her mother present in her own private life with the hushed care that grieving daughters bring to such tasks. She kept, on her writing table at Buckingham House, a minor portrait of her mother that had been brought from Mirow with her in 1761. She wore, on appropriate occasions, an unassuming mourning ring containing a little piece of her mother's hair which had been given to her in those final weeks of preparation. She referred to her mother, in her conversations with her closer attendants and with her own daughters as they grew up, with the affection that the period considered the proper attitude. She kept, in her own limited private prayers, the measured remembrance that her mother had taught her was the proper response to the death of someone deeply loved. But the mother was, in any direct sense, gone. Charlotte's life, from 1761 onwards, was conducted without her. The still decisions that Charlotte would make over the next 57 years, the subdued triumphs and the low griefs, and the daily routines of her long English life would all be conducted in the hushed absence of the woman who had raised her. The mother's voice would echo in Charlotte's own decisions. The mother's careful habits would shape Charlotte's own deliberate habits. But the mother herself was not there, in any accessible sense, to be consulted. Charlotte was from 1761 on her own. There is something, I think, particularly worth noting about this in the attentive arithmetic of daughters and the women who form them. The parents who shape us most are often the ones we lose at the moment we most need them. The teaching has been done, the foundations have been laid, the character has been formed, and then, in the cruelty of mortality, the teacher is taken away just as the lesson is about to be put to its largest test. The daughter goes on alone, carrying that voice into the rest of her life. She does, more or less, what Elisabeth Albertine would have wanted. She lives, more or less, the kind of life Elisabeth Albertine would have approved of. She manages, as such daughters manage, to honour the work in the daily texture of her own conduct. But the loneliness of doing it alone is real, and it accumulates, in the measured way of all such losses, in the woman who carries it. Charlotte's life in England, conducted across 57 years from 1761 to 1818, was the long accumulated demonstration of her mother's work. She raised 15 children in the measured pattern she had inherited at Mirow. She maintained her household with the discipline Elisabeth Albertine had modelled. She kept up her devotional duties, protected her intellectual life, and attended to the people in her care with the habits her upbringing had given her. The English court watching her across those 57 years, saw the daughter without ever fully understanding the woman who had formed her. Elisabeth Albertine had been in the arithmetic of Charlotte's life the most important figure that the English court had never met. We will, in a moment, follow Charlotte to England and to the private life she made there. But before we do, let us spend a little more time at Mirow, in the low of the months and years after Charlotte's departure, with the family who remained behind. Because the family who remained behind also continued, in the steady way that families do, after the central figure of their lives had gone. And the way they continued is itself part of the hushed story of Elisabeth Albertine and the patient work she had done. Christiane, the eldest surviving daughter, remained at Mirow for some years after her mother's death. She moved, in due course, to Strelitz, where she joined her brother's household in the measured way of unmarried sisters of reigning princes of the period. She would correspond with Charlotte for the rest of her life, in the steady way that the two sisters had always corresponded since they had first been able to write. The correspondence is, by the standards of 18th century princess correspondence, unusually warm and unusually frequent. They wrote, on average, perhaps once a month for nearly 30 years. The letters were still reports of the daily lives of two women whose paths had diverged in the most extreme way possible, but whose subdued affection had not, at any point, been disturbed by the divergence. Christiane would die in 1794, having never married, having spent her entire life in the low of the duchy in which she had been raised. Charlotte received the news in England with the hushed grief of a woman losing her last remaining sister. Adolphus Frederick, the elder brother, would visit Charlotte in England several times in the years that followed. He came in 1764, 3 years after the marriage, in the first of the still state visits that the relationship between the two royal houses required. He came again, on later occasions, when his subdued duchy could spare him. He maintained, with Charlotte, the low correspondence that brothers and sisters of his rank conducted across the European post. He died in 1794, in the same year as Christiane, having reigned over Mecklenburg-Strelitz for the better part of 50 years. Charlotte received the news of his death in England with the hushed grief of a woman losing the brother who had, more than anyone, arranged the entire trajectory of her adult life. Sophia Albertine, the next sister, became the Abbess of Hereford in the steady way of Protestant religious princesses of the period. She lived in the still of that position for many decades. She would outlive most of her siblings. She would die in 1810, at the age of 80, having spent her life in the subdued religious work that she had chosen. Charlotte's correspondence with her was less frequent than with Christiane, but no less affectionate, and the news of her death was in turn received in England with the low grief of a woman watching her family be taken away from her, sibling by sibling, across the hushed decades of her long English life. Charles, the younger brother, would have the most spectacular career of any of the siblings. He entered the Hanoverian army in his young adulthood. He served with distinction in the 7 Years' War. He rose in the steady way of competent professional military men of the period to the highest positions in the Hanoverian service. He would, in time, become Field Marshal and would govern Hanover on behalf of the British Crown for many years. He married Friederike of Hesse-Darmstadt and had a large family with her. His daughter Louise would in time become Queen of Prussia and would be the famous beautiful queen who stood up to Napoleon at Tilsit in 1807 and whose early death in 1810 was mourned across Protestant Europe. Charles himself would survive into the next century, dying in 1816 at the age of 75, having been one of the still steadier and more competent figures of his generation. Charlotte's relationship with him was warm. She corresponded with him regularly. She was, in the steady way particularly proud of his accomplished daughter Louise, whose subdued career across Europe Charlotte followed in detail across the low correspondences of the period. George Augustus, the youngest brother, also entered military service. He died young, at 36, in 1785. Charlotte, by then in her early 40s, received the news in England with the hushed grief of an older sister losing the youngest of her family. He was, in the steady way that the youngest brothers of larger families sometimes are, the still favourite of his older sisters, and his early death was, in the arithmetic of family losses, one of the more painful of the various losses that Charlotte experienced from her German family across the decades of her English life. But all of this was still in the future. We are still in the subdued story of tonight, on the morning of the 17th of August 1761, in the low courtyard at Mirow, with the carriages just disappearing up the road towards Strelitz. The mother dead, the daughter departing, the family standing in the courtyard watching her go, the hushed household of Mirow about to settle, for the first time in nearly 30 years, into the still of an establishment that no longer contained the woman who had been its central figure since 1735. The household at Mirow, after the departure of Charlotte and the death of her mother, became, in the steady way, a much smaller and much quieter establishment. Christiane stayed for some years before joining her brother at Strelitz. The younger children moved, one by one, to their various adult positions. The household staff was reduced. The subdued routines that had defined Elisabeth Albertine's 9 years of widowhood were gradually dismantled. The residence itself, by the early 1770s, was no longer functioning as a primary residence of any member of the family. It was being maintained by a small caretaker staff, in the steady way that disused princely residences of the period were maintained, in case any member of the family should wish to visit it again. The chapel, where Elisabeth Albertine and her husband were buried, was kept in the low condition of careful preservation that such family burial places required. The graves were tended. The hushed annual Lutheran services for the dead members of the family were conducted on the appropriate dates. The still commemoration that the period considered the proper response to the deaths of beloved family members was, in this subdued way, maintained. Charlotte, in England, would have been informed of these small annual services. She would have, in her own private rooms in London, or Kew, or Windsor, conducted her own small private commemorations on the same dates. The low ritual remembrance of a mother by her distant daughter, conducted in parallel from 2 different countries, would continue for the entirety of Charlotte's English life. Now let us briefly follow Charlotte to England in the hushed weeks after her departure from Mirow. The journey from Mirow to Strelitz took 2 days. The careful retinue arrived at Strelitz, where Charlotte was received by her brother in the still state that the situation required. She spent several days at Strelitz, completing the subdued final preparations and receiving the formal farewells of the duchy's small ceremonial life. She then departed Strelitz for the long journey across northern Germany to the coast at Stade. The journey to Stade took the better part of 2 weeks. The low wedding party travelled in slow, careful stages, stopping each night at the residences of various small princely relatives or at suitable inns when no princely residence was available. The hushed retinue was considerable. There were the carriages of Charlotte herself and her senior attendants. There were the carriages of the various German dignitaries who were accompanying her to the coast. There were the carriages of the English emissaries who had come to escort her. There were the carriages and wagons containing the still baggage of the journey, including her trousseau and the subdued personal possessions she was bringing with her into her new life. The long train must have stretched, on the small narrow roads of North Germany, for some considerable distance. Charlotte herself, throughout this journey, conducted herself with the low grace that the period required. She received, at each stopping place, the hushed formal welcomes and farewells that the situation required. She conducted at each halt the still polite conversations with the subdued dignitaries that the diplomatic protocol of the period demanded. She did, in short, what such departing princesses had always done. She held herself together for the whole accumulated public performance of the journey. She was, however, also 17 years old. Her mother had died 7 weeks before. She was about to leave the country of her birth, perhaps forever, for a country she had never seen. She was about to marry a man she had never met. The low weight of all of this, conducted in the daily routine of a slow, uncomfortable carriage journey across the hushed North German landscape, must have been very considerable. The still diaries and letters that survive from members of the wedding party do not, by the small reserved standards of the period, dwell on Charlotte's emotional state during the journey. They do, however, contain the subdued evidence that she was at moments visibly distressed, and that her senior attendants, including the German women who would be travelling with her to England, conducted themselves throughout the journey with the kindness that the situation required. The 2 senior German women who would accompany Charlotte to England in the low long-term capacity of her private attendants were Madame Hagedorn and Madame Schwellenberg. They had been chosen for the position by the family at Strelitz, with the careful approval of Charlotte's brother and the hushed input of Charlotte herself. They were, in different ways, both serious women. Madame Hagedorn was the senior of the 2, somewhat older, and was a woman of considerable refinement and considerable kindness, whose still presence in the wedding party would be a great comfort to Charlotte across the difficult weeks of the journey and the early months of her English residence. Madame Schwellenberg was younger, less refined, more strong-willed, and would in time become one of the most controversial figures of the early English court because of her difficult manner. Both of them, however, were sincerely devoted to Charlotte. Both of them would serve her for many years. Madame Hagedorn would die in 1764, only 3 years after the arrival in England, in the subdued tragedy that took from Charlotte one of the small 2 figures from her German past who were closest to her. Madame Schwellenberg would survive until 1797 and would be the faithful attendant of Charlotte's German memory for the better part of 40 years. The 2 women travelled in Charlotte's own carriage, in the steady way that senior attendants of royal brides traditionally travelled. They sat with her, they talked to her, they prayed with her in the devotional times of the day. They listened, in the steady way of attentive senior women, to whatever Charlotte herself wanted to say about the low weight of the journey. They were, in this hushed way, the continuing presence of the German world that Charlotte was leaving behind. They would be, for many years to come, the still link between the Mirow that had formed her and the England in which she would live the rest of her life. The wedding party reached Stade in the 2nd week of September. Stade was in 1761 a small port on the North German coast, in territory belonging to the Electorate of Hanover, which was personally united with the British Crown. The choice of Stade as the embarkation point had been a subdued diplomatic decision. It was the closest German port that was, in the arithmetic of the period, indisputably under British protection. The low journey across North Germany had thus brought Charlotte, in some hushed sense, into British territory before she had even boarded the ship. The English ship that was to convey her to England was waiting at Stade. It was the royal yacht Charlotte, which had been appropriately renamed for the occasion. The still journey from Stade to Harwich, which was the English port at which she would land, would normally have taken several days in fair weather. The crossing was not, however, made in fair weather. It was made in early September, at the cusp of the subdued season, when North Sea storms become serious, and the voyage that ensued was, in the arithmetic of Charlotte's life, one of the small, most extraordinary episodes of her 17 years. But that voyage, with all its low drama, is its own story, and we have in earlier nights of this series told it. Tonight is not about the voyage. Tonight is about the woman who was no longer there to witness Charlotte's voyage. Tonight is about Elisabeth Albertine, the mother who had made Queen Charlotte and who had been dead. By the time Charlotte stepped onto the ship it stayed for nearly 2.5 months. So let us return for the hushed rest of tonight to the still meaning of that mother in the secluded life of her daughter. Let us walk through the subdued decades of Charlotte's English life and trace, in the measured way, the low places where Elisabeth Albertine's hand can still be felt in her daughter's conduct, even 50 years after her death. The most obvious legacy was religious. Charlotte arrived in England in 1761 as a serious Lutheran, in the measured way her mother had taught her. The English court was Anglican, in the measured way that the English crown had been Anglican since the Reformation. The two traditions were not, in the arithmetic of Protestant Christianity, far apart, but they were not the same. Charlotte was required, in the hushed formal sense, to conform to the Anglican service in her English public life. She did so. She attended the Anglican services at the Chapel Royal and at the various royal residences. She received the Anglican sacraments. She took her Anglican religious duties seriously, in the measured way her mother had taught her to take all religious duties seriously. But she was also, in the still personal sense, a Lutheran for the rest of her life. She maintained, in her own household apartments at Buckingham House and at Kew and at Windsor, the subdued devotional habits that her mother had taught her. She read the Lutheran scriptures in German in her morning devotions. She sang the Lutheran hymns of her childhood in her own reserved times of prayer. She kept, throughout her life, the Lutheran piety of her German upbringing as the underlying texture of her religious life, with the Anglican observance laid carefully over the top in the measured way her position required. The mother had given her this. The daughter kept it for 57 years. The intellectual legacy was equally substantial. Charlotte arrived in England as an earnest reader. In the measured way her mother had trained her to be one. She continued to be a disciplined reader for the rest of her life. The 4,000-volume library that she eventually built up at Buckingham House, in conjunction with the King's much larger library, was the low extension of the reading habits that her mother had instilled in her at Mirow under Madame de Grabau's tutelage. She read in German and French and English. She read devout across a wide range of subjects. She corresponded with sober people about committed books. The hushed intellectual life that distinguished her from many of her predecessors and successors as Queen's Consort of England was, in the proper sense, the still extension of the subdued intellectual life that her mother had given her in Mirow. The maternal legacy was the most complex. Charlotte raised, between 1762 and 1783, 15 children. She did so in the pattern she had inherited at Mirow, with adjustments for the very different conditions of the English court. She involved herself directly in their education, supervised their religious upbringing, corresponded with them when they were grown, and tried to give them the structure Elisabeth Albertine had given her. She did not, in every case, succeed. The English court was a much more difficult environment for raising children than Mirow had been. The Prince of Wales, her eldest son, would in time become a source of anguish, conducting his adult life in opposition to much of what she and his father had tried to teach him. Several other children would also, in their adult lives, fail to live up to the expectations she had carried for them. The arithmetic of large royal families in difficult periods was such that good intentions could not, in every case, produce the results those intentions deserved. But the patient work was done. The mother had tried in the steady way her own mother had tried with her. The low trying, even when it did not produce the hushed results she had hoped for, was the still honour she had given to the memory of the woman who had raised her. She had, in the strict sense, done what her mother would have wanted her to do. The subdued outcomes were not, in every case, in her control. The emotional legacy is the most difficult to describe. Charlotte was, by all accounts of those who knew her well, reserved and sober in public bearing. She was warm with those she trusted, guarded with those she did not, and formal when her position required it. She did not cultivate courtly charm in the manner of certain other queens of the period, and she did not seek to be loved by the crowd. Throughout her long English life, she conducted herself with the dignified reserve her mother had taught her was proper for a princess. That reserve served her well over the long term. It did not, however, make her popular in the short-term ways that more theatrical queens were popular. The English public, for much of her reign, viewed her with respect that did not quite become affection. She did not mind. She had not, as her mother had taught her, been raised to seek affection. She had been raised to do her duty. She did her duty. The affection, when it came at all, came late in her life, when her suffering through her husband's madness, and her dignity in carrying it, had earned sympathy that her earlier years had not provoked. There is one more subdued thing to say, before we move toward the conclusion of tonight's story, about the low relationship between Elisabeth Albertine and Charlotte. It concerns in the discipline the hushed nature of mother-daughter relationships in the 18th century more generally, and the pattern that this particular mother-daughter relationship fits into the still larger pattern. The 18th century was not, in any obvious sense, an age that encouraged demonstrative emotion between mothers and daughters of high rank. The subdued reserve that the period considered the proper bearing of serious women was applied in the habit, even to the low relationships between mothers and their female children. The mother who was most devoted to her daughters did not necessarily express her devotion in the hushed demonstrative ways that we might recognize today. The expression was contained within the daily routines of the household, the still supervision of the schoolroom, the subdued correspondence between mother and daughter when they were apart, the low practical care for the daughter's well-being. Within this hushed, reserved framework, however, the relationship between Elisabeth Albertine and Charlotte was, by the reports that survive, particularly close. The mother had spent more time with this particular daughter than with any of her other surviving children, by the arithmetic of how the family had developed across the 2 decades of Elisabeth Albertine's adult life. The older sisters were grown and gone or settled in their own positions by the time Charlotte was reaching adolescence. The younger brothers had their own tutors and their own developing interests. Charlotte was, in the final years of her mother's life, the daughter most directly under her mother's daily eye. The still intensity of the relationship between them, in those final years, was therefore particularly considerable. Charlotte spoke of her mother, throughout her own English life, in terms that were, by the reserved standards of the period, unusually warm. She referred to her in conversations with her own daughters as their grandmother had been. She quoted her, in subdued correspondence with various people, on low matters of conduct and opinion. She mentioned her in the small private correspondence with her sister Christiane that continued for 30 years, with the affection of a woman whose mother was constantly in her thoughts. The mother, dead in 1761, was alive in Charlotte's hushed mental life for the entirety of the next 57 years. This is not, in any unusual sense, surprising. It is, in the discipline, simply what serious daughters of well-loved serious mothers do. They carry their mothers with them. They consult them, in their own minds, on the still decisions they have to make. They imagine what their mothers would have thought of the subdued developments of their own lives. They feel their mother's approval and disapproval, even decades after the mother's deaths. in the pattern that the well-loved children of well-loving parents always do. Charlotte was, in this low way, an entirely ordinary loving daughter, and the habit she carried her mother through her long English life was the hushed ordinary way that loving daughters carry such mothers. What made the still case of Charlotte and Elisabeth Albertine slightly extraordinary was simply the public consequence of it. Charlotte's subdued decisions across her 57 years as Queen of England were, in any real sense, the indirect consequences of the patient work that her mother had done at Mirow between 1744 and 1761. The English court, which had never met Elisabeth Albertine, was nevertheless shaped, in low indirect ways, by her hand. The hushed cultural patronage that Charlotte extended to musicians and writers and scholars was the still extension of her mother's subdued intellectual seriousness. The low religious tone of her court was the hushed extension of her mother's still Lutheran piety, adapted for Anglican conditions. The subdued maternal style with which she raised her own children was the low extension of the hushed maternal style she had observed in her own childhood. In all of these still ways, Elisabeth Albertine reigned, for 57 years, in England through the subdued medium of her daughter. She had never crossed the Channel. She had never met any English person of consequence. She had been, in any direct sense, a forgotten German dowager duchess of an obscure duchy who had died at 48 in a quiet German residence, having lived a life that the low histories of the 18th century had no particular reason to remember. But her patient work had, through her daughter, shaped a substantial portion of the hushed cultural and religious and domestic life of the British Crown through the second half of the 18th century and the early years of the 19th. The still music room at Buckingham House, where Mozart had played as a child of 8 in 1764, was Elisabeth Albertine's subdued music room, transposed to a different country. The low library at Buckingham House, with its 4,000 volumes, was Elisabeth Albertine's hushed library, expanded enormously and laid out in a different building. The still nursery at Kew, where Charlotte raised her own children with the subdued personal involvement that her mother had modelled, was Elisabeth Albertine's low nursery, transposed across the sea and across the generations. The hushed reach of a serious mother's work, in the arithmetic of mother-daughter influence, can be very considerable. Elisabeth Albertine's still reach, through Charlotte, extended to a great many of the subdued cultural and domestic developments of British royal life across 2 generations. She would have been, had she lived to see it, deeply gratified in the low reserved way that her own piety and her own seriousness would have permitted her to be gratified. She would have been also in the steady way of all such mothers deeply loving of the daughter whose work it had become to carry her mother's hushed teaching across the sea. Now let us, for the still rest of tonight, return to the subdued world of Mirow itself, in the years and decades after Charlotte's departure and her mother's death, because Mirow continued to exist, in any meaningful sense, even after the low woman who had been its central figure was no longer in it. And the steady way Mirow continued is itself a kind of hushed continuation of Elisabeth Albertine's still story. The residence at Mirow by the late 1760s was no longer occupied as a primary residence by any member of the family. Charlotte's brother Adolphus Frederick lived primarily at Strelitz, in his subdued capacity as the reigning duke. Christiane joined him there for her remaining years. The younger brothers had moved on to their various adult careers. Sophia Albertine had moved to Hereford for her religious position. The household at Mirow was reduced to a small caretaker staff, who maintained the building and its low grounds in the hushed condition of careful preservation that was the standard of the period for disused princely residences. The still Lutheran chapel where Elisabeth Albertine and her husband were buried was, however, kept in active use. The pastor who served the parish church in the town also conducted in the discipline the subdued services that the family chapel required. The low annual commemorations of the deaths of the family members buried there were observed on the appropriate dates with the hushed participation of whoever in the family was able to be present. The graves themselves were, in the pattern, tended by a still staff of gardeners who maintained the subdued grounds of the chapel and the residence as a whole. Charlotte herself never returned to Mirow. The low arithmetic of her position as Queen of England did not, at any point in her 57 years as Queen, permit such a journey. She would have liked to. She said so in the hushed correspondence with her sister on a number of still occasions across the decades. She would have liked to visit her mother's grave again. She would have liked to walk again in the subdued gardens of her childhood. She would have liked to sit again in the hushed rooms where she had received her education. She would have liked to do all of these low things, in the habit that all of us would like to revisit the hushed places of our childhoods, but the arithmetic of her position made it impossible. The Queen of England did not, in the manner of the period, leave the country except in the most extraordinary circumstances. Charlotte did not, across her 57 years, ever leave Britain. The still familiar landscape of her childhood at Mirow was, from August 1761 onwards, a subdued landscape that existed only in her memory. She kept it, however, in considerable detail. The low correspondence with Christiane, conducted across 30 years, contains regular hushed references to specific still features of the residence and the town. The subdued walk along the lake, the low chapel with its hushed graves, the still schoolroom on the upper floor, the subdued kitchen garden behind the residence. Charlotte remembered all of these low features in considerable detail, and she referred to them in her hushed correspondence with the affection of a woman whose memory had been carefully preserved by the patient work of remembering. Christiane, for her part, would visit the residence on still occasions across the years and would report back to Charlotte in the subdued correspondence on the low state of the place, the hushed developments of the still trees that had been planted in their childhood, the subdued changes in the low population of the town, the hushed minor renovations that the still caretaker staff had carried out. Christiane reported on all of these subdued developments in the low detail that Charlotte's hushed remembering required. The two sisters between them maintained across 30 years the mental continuity of the still childhood landscape that Charlotte could no longer visit, but that she had not, in any meaningful sense, ever left. When Christiane died in 1794, the subdued correspondence about Mirow ceased. Charlotte was 50 at the time of her sister's death. She had, by then, been Queen of England for 33 years. She had borne all 15 of her children. She had managed her husband's first major breakdown of 1788 and 1789. She had, in the arithmetic of her own life, more or less arrived at the low centre of her long reign. The hushed last letter from Christiane, which arrived at Buckingham House in the still weeks before her death, contained, by the reports that survive, the affectionate news of the residence at Mirow that Christiane had been reporting for the better part of 3 decades. Charlotte read the letter. She read it by the subdued reports several times in the days after it arrived. She placed it, when she had finished reading it for the last time, in the low box of family correspondence that she kept in her own private rooms. She continued in the steady way, with the patient work of being Queen of England. The hushed story of Elisabeth Albertine's patient work in the arithmetic of her daughter's life is largely the story we have just told. There is one further still chapter, however, which belongs to the late period of Charlotte's life and which deserves, in the final movement of tonight's story, its own brief telling. In the last decade of Charlotte's life, between approximately 1808 and 1818, she became more reflective in the steady way that long-lived people sometimes do. Her husband's permanent loss of mind in 1810 removed from her the daily companionship of the man who had, more than anyone, witnessed her own adult life. Her granddaughter Princess Charlotte's death in 1817 removed from her the subdued, bright young hope that the next generation of the family represented. Her own health, in the last years of her life, was no longer what it had been. She was, in the steady way of women in their late 60s and early 70s, slowing down. She was thinking about the past more than she was thinking about the future. She was, in the low phrase, taking stock, in this hushed late period, that the still memory of her mother became, by the reports of those closest to her, more present in her conversation than it had been in earlier years. She mentioned her mother more often. She quoted her more frequently. She referred to subdued incidents from her childhood at Mirow that had not been part of her usual repertoire of low reminiscences. She seemed, in the steady way that the elderly sometimes do, to be drawing closer in her own mental life to the woman who had been the central figure of her childhood. The mother, dead for over 50 years by then, was returning to the hushed centre of the daughter's still mental life as the daughter approached her own death. Charlotte died on the 17th of November 1818 at Kew, in the subdued upright position that her last illness required. She was 74. She had been Queen of England for 57 years. She had been a widow, in fact, although not in technical status, for 8 years. She had been a mother for 56 years. She had been, for 57 years, the daughter of a woman who had been dead all that time. The low reports of her death describe a hushed ending. She was sitting up in her chair because she could no longer breathe lying down. The Prince of Wales, her difficult eldest son, was holding her hand. Several of her daughters were in the room. The still household of Kew was waiting in the subdued adjoining rooms. The pastor who attended her had administered, in the low final hours, the Anglican sacraments that her position required. She had also, by the personal reports of her dressers, made the hushed household Lutheran prayers that her mother had taught her in the final moments of her life. She died in the late afternoon. The still household received the news in the measured way that royal households receive such news. The subdued bells of the country tolled, in the measured way that the low death of a queen consort required. The hushed public mourning was conducted in the measured way that the still state managed such occasions. The subdued, measured family rituals of grief were conducted in the low reserved rooms at Kew and elsewhere. She was buried at Windsor, beside the king who was, by then, locked away in his own hushed madness, and who would not be told of her death in any meaningful way for some weeks afterwards. She was buried with the still state ceremony that her position required. She was, in the arithmetic of British royal funerals, given an entirely appropriate ending. There was, however, one subdued detail of her burial arrangements that deserves the attention here, because it points to the low continuation of the hushed relationship we have been following. Charlotte had specified, in her still will, that certain personal objects were to be buried with her. The list was modest. A Lutheran prayer book, in German, that had belonged to her mother and that she had brought with her from Mirow in 1761. A portrait miniature of her mother, also from her childhood. A lock of her mother's hair, set in a mourning ring. These subdued objects were the possessions that connected Charlotte most directly to Elisabeth Albertine. She wanted them with her. The subdued wish was respected. The items were placed in her coffin at her burial. In this quiet way, the daughter and the mother were, after 57 years of separation across the sea, brought back together in the hushed symbolic sense. The mother's prayer book lay against the daughter's body. The mother's portrait, was at her side. The mother's hair was in the ring on her finger. The still reunion was, in the measured way, the only one that the arithmetic of their 2 lives had permitted. Let us, for the last part of tonight, return one final time to Mirow. Not to the Mirow of 1761, in the subdued weeks of grief and departure that we have been describing, but to the Mirow of an imagined later moment, in the discipline that we sometimes return, in our minds, to the low places of long-finished events. Imagine, if you will, walking through Mirow in the hush of an autumn afternoon, perhaps in the year 1820, 2 years after Charlotte's death. The residence is still there, in the pattern that such buildings persist. It is no longer occupied as a primary residence. It is being maintained, in the habit of the period, by a quiet caretaker staff. The subdued grounds are kept in reasonable condition. The still trees that had been planted in Charlotte's childhood are now substantial. The subdued lake at the foot of the quiet rise is, in the manner, the lake it had been 70 years before. Walk through the courtyard. The cobblestones are the cobblestones, the walls of the wings are the walls. The central block is the central block. The building has not, in any obvious sense, changed substantially since Charlotte left it in August of 1761. Walk into the hushed entrance hall. The still panelling is the panelling. The subdued floor is the floor. The low portraits on the walls are the portraits, although they have, in the discipline of paintings, darkened somewhat with the years. Walk up the hushed staircase. The still treads are the treads. The subdued handrail is the handrail. The low landings are the familiar landings. The hushed doors that open off the still upper corridors are those doors. The subdued nurseries, where Charlotte and her siblings had been raised, are those nurseries, although they are now empty. The low schoolrooms where Madame de Grabeau had taught are those schoolrooms, although they are also now empty. The still rooms where the family had eaten and slept and prayed and read are all there, in their hushed original arrangement, although none of them are, in any current sense, in active use. Walk down the back stairs to the subdued chapel. The chapel, unlike most of the rest of the residence, is in active use. Annual services for the dead members of the family continue there, and the graves are tended. The pastor who serves the parish church in the town also conducts, in the usual order, the rituals that the family chapel requires. The graves of Elisabeth Albertine and Charles Louis Frederick remain side by side in the central position of the chapel. The marble slabs are slightly worn from 60 years of weather and use. The inscriptions remain legible, although the lettering has lost some of its original sharpness. The names, the dates, the brief Lutheran formula of commemoration that the period preferred, all of it remains there, as such inscriptions persist across the decades. Stand for a moment in the hush of the chapel and consider what these subdued graves have witnessed across the 60 years since Elisabeth Albertine was placed in hers in 1761. The departure of her 17-year-old daughter for England, weeks after her own burial, the establishment of that daughter as Queen of England, the births of 15 royal grandchildren whom she would never meet, the long reign, the madness of the king, the death of the granddaughter Princess Charlotte, the death, 2 years before this imagined visit, of the daughter herself, whose own coffin contained, by her request, the personal objects that connected her, in symbolic fashion, back to this grave. The arithmetic of these witnessings is, in the proper sense, considerable. Elisabeth Albertine, in the low of her grave, presided invisibly over the entirety of her daughter's English reign. The reign happened, the children were born, the tragedies and triumphs unfolded. The woman in the grave at Mirow knew none of it, in any direct sense. But the reign, in another quiet sense, was the extension of her own patient work. Everything Charlotte did across her 57 years in England was, in the discipline, the continuation of what her mother had begun at Mirow before 1761. This is, in the strict sense, the meaning of the relationship we have been following tonight. An earnest parent in an obscure German residence raised a daughter between 1744 and 1761, according to the pattern her own piety and judgment suggested was proper. She did not know what kind of life Charlotte would eventually be required to live. She did not know at any point that her daughter would become Queen of England. She did the work because the work was simply what devoted women did with their daughters. She raised her child to be disciplined, capable, and morally grounded, regardless of what kind of future that child would face. The work was done. The daughter, in due course, was given a life far more public and demanding than Elisabeth Albertine had anticipated. Charlotte conducted that life across 57 years in the habit she had been taught. She did so without being able to consult the woman who had formed her on any of the decisions she had to make, because Elisabeth Albertine had died before the daughter's adult life had begun. Charlotte carried that training with her into every room she ever entered. Let us, before we close tonight's story, return for a quiet final time to the picture this whole story has been gathering around. A woman and her daughter in a German residence, in the subdued years before the separation that would define both of their remaining lives. It is, perhaps, an evening at Mirow in the year 1758. Charlotte is 14. Her mother is 45. Her father has been dead for 6 years. Her older brother is at Strelitz being prepared for his eventual rule. Her older sister Christiane is 23 and is, in the steady way, the elder sister and assistant to her mother in the running of the household. The younger brothers are 8 and 10. The household at Mirow is in the quiet of an ordinary autumn evening. The supper is over. The family has gathered, as it does on most evenings, in the drawing room on the ground floor of the residence. The mother sits in her usual chair by the fire. Christiane sits across from her with her embroidery. Charlotte sits beside her mother, with a book open on her lap, reading aloud in the steady way that the family practices. The book is a German translation of a French moralist whose name is no longer in the hushed archives of the period certain. Charlotte is reading a passage about the proper conduct of a serious young woman. Her mother is listening, with the still attention of a mother who has heard many such readings before. The lamps are lit. The fire is steady. The hushed room is warm. The curtains are drawn against the darkness outside. The younger boys, who have already been put to bed, are upstairs in the nursery wing. The household staff are in the lower rooms, in the hush of the evening hour. The whole residence, in this picture, is in the quiet condition of any quiet household, at any peaceful evening hour. Charlotte finishes the passage. She looks up. She looks at her mother. Her mother looks at her with the approving attention that the good reading has produced. The mother says something, approving. Charlotte smiles. Christiane, across the room, also smiles. The reading continues, in the familiar way of such evenings, with the next passage. This is, in the steady way, the picture that Charlotte would carry with her into every room of every English residence she would ever inhabit. The small, still evening in the drawing room at Mirow, the mother in her chair by the fire, the sister with her embroidery, the book in the daughter's lap. The approving attention of the mother as the daughter read the passage of the moralist, whose name no one would, in the centuries to come, particularly remember. The picture is, in the arithmetic of Charlotte's life, the central image of who she was and who she would always remain, not the queen, not the consort of the king, not the mother of 15 children, not the patron of Mozart and Bach and Burney and Delany, not the dowager who survived her husband's madness and her granddaughter's death, and outlived nearly all of her closest companions. Beneath all of these quiet public figures, in the subdued centre of the woman she always was the still 14-year-old girl in the still drawing room at Mirow, reading aloud to the approving mother whose approval she would, in some small sense, spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. This is, in the final arithmetic, what mothers give to their daughters. Not instructions alone, not rules alone. An ongoing internal sense of being approved of by the woman whose approval matters most. The daughter carries this sense forward into the rest of her life. She acts in difficult moments, in the way that would have been approved. She refrains in tempting moments from actions that would not. The remembered parent becomes a permanent inward guide for adult life. For Charlotte, that guide was Elisabeth Albertine as she remembered her. Seated in the drawing room at Mirow in the hush of an autumn evening in 1758, Charlotte carried that inward guide with her for the rest of her life. It was not available for consultation. Elisabeth Albertine had died in 1761, but the internal presence remained active in the decisions Charlotte made and the rooms she entered. Dead at 48, Elisabeth Albertine accompanied her daughter through 57 years of British public life. The reach of a mother's work in the arithmetic of mother-daughter influence can be considerable. Elisabeth Albertine's reach was considerable indeed. We have, in the discipline, come to the close of tonight's story. The mother who made Queen Charlotte, the German princess in the small German residence whose work shaped, through her daughter, a substantial portion of British royal life across 2 generations. The hushed woman who died at 48, who never crossed the Channel, who never met any of her grandchildren, who never saw her daughter as queen, who never knew, in any direct sense, what her work had become. She was buried at Mirow in the summer of 1761. She lies there still. The modest chapel is still standing. The modest grave is still tended. The marble slab still bears in the worn lettering her name and dates and the brief Lutheran formula of commemoration. She is in the pattern still there, in the hushed of the North German village, where she spent the greater part of her adult life. If you find yourself, on some future occasion, in that part of Germany, you might consider the visit. The chapel is open to the public, in the habit that such chapels are. You can stand at the grave. You can read the worn inscription. You can, in the manner, pay the tribute that her work deserves. She would not, in the way of her own piety and her own seriousness, have wanted any greater commemoration than that. She would not have wanted statues. She would not have wanted ceremonial visits. She would have wanted, in the steady way she had always wanted, only the hushed remembrance that the dead deserve from the living, the prayer, the reflection, the still acknowledgement that her work mattered. It did matter. Through her daughter, it mattered considerably. Across 2 generations of British royal life, through the calm cultural and religious and domestic developments that Charlotte's reign produced, through the small continuing influence of her daughter's example, the work of Elisabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen mattered considerably more than any of her contemporaries could have anticipated. The obscure German princess in the obscure German residence shaped, in the muted indirect way that all serious mothers shape their daughters, the woman who would, in the arithmetic of British history, become one of the longest reigning consorts the country had ever known. The patient work was done. The work mattered. The woman who did it deserves, in the steady way, the remembrance of those of us who, in our different times and our different places, also know what it is to have been raised by a devoted mother in a disciplined household, and who carry, into the rest of our own lives, the quiet, permanent inner companion that such a mother becomes. So as you settle down tonight, perhaps with the lights low and the accumulated weight of the day behind you. I would ask you to hold for a moment the picture we have been gathering. The mother in the chair by the fire at Mirow in 1758, the daughter beside her with the book, the sister across the room with her embroidery, the lamps lit, the curtains drawn, the whole evening of a disciplined household at the end of a serious day. Hold that picture, if you can, in the deliberate way that we hold such pictures of the half-hidden pasts that have made us. The mother is approving, the daughter is reading, the sister is smiling, the household is at peace. That picture, in the intimate, accumulated arithmetic of mothers and daughters more generally, is the picture that all serious mothers want their daughters to be able to carry forward. The image of the moment when everything was right. The image of the calm evening at home with the people one most loved. The image of being simply approved of in the minor careful way that the well-loved children of well-loving mothers are approved of, in the low ordinary moments that turn out, in the careful arithmetic of our long lives, to have been the most important moments we ever lived through. Charlotte carried that picture for 57 years. Whatever you carry, of whoever raised you, hold it tonight as you go to sleep. The mother in the chair, the fire, the book, the peaceful evening at home. Thank you for spending this evening with me at Mirow. Sleep well.